Sylas slipped out of his lab coat, smoothed his black shirt, and hung the coat on its hook. A full day with toxins hadn't touched him. His green eyes stayed flat behind black frames, his lean posture straight as a rod. He left the university to a trail of greetings from students and faculty. He answered each with a short nod and kept moving, long strides cutting through the open first floor with its pillars and winter wind. The air was brisk and clean. It felt a little too dark for 4 o'clock. A hot dog vendor on the corner ranted to a customer. Global warming, I'm telling you. First week of December and no snow. Sylas didn't slow. Night and day had nothing to do with weather. Or did they? He let the thought spin. If polar mass shifted the axial tilt even slightly, daylight windows would change. He let equations unspool in his head. Most people would scoff. He didn't blame them. The truth usually sat somewhere in the middle. He walked until home rose in front of him, a sleek suburban place near campus, 3-car garage, tidy lawn, quiet street. He stepped in, toed off his shoes, and paused. Noise. Not TV. Voices. An argument, muffled and low, coming from the basement. His mother and sister appeared from the living room. His sister, Ilera, clung to her, eyes shiny. You're home, his mother said, forcing a smile. I keep telling you to take a car. Why walk every day? It's not far, he said, ruffling Ilera's hair. It's at least 5 kilometers. It's already dark and your class ended at 4. It isn't safe out there. He let her talk. If he wanted distance, he'd have moved out already. At 26, with tenure in hand, he stayed because he wanted to. He didn't drink, party, or smoke. Friends, yes. Best friends, no. Girlfriends who liked the idea of him, not the person. Homeworked. I'll see what's going on, he said. She hesitated, then nodded. He headed down. No rage. Just tight, tired voices. His father, Cedric, and his grandfather, Magnus, stood on opposite sides of the pool table. Cedric, I'm your father, Magnus said. When have I steered you wrong? We need to return. It's our best chance. Return where? Cedric snapped. You want us to pack up and go across the world now? Sylas just got tenure. Ilera is finishing middle school. How is that reasonable? The secular world won't matter in a few months, Magnus said. I don't get it. I've never gotten it. You've said this since I was a kid. They both saw Sylas at the doorway and stopped before the fight crossed a line. Magnus was about to bring up the past. Sylas was glad he didn't. His grandmother was not a topic that ended well. Cedric cleared his throat. Sylas, what's going on? Sylas asked. Cedric glanced at Magnus. You're old enough to know some things. Then say it, Sylas said. Magnus exhaled. The world will enter upheaval soon. Or at best. Something worse at worst. Our safest move is the Brown estate. Cedric folded his arms. Apocalypse talk again. Sylas studied them. Magnus showed no signs of slipping. 70s, bronze skin, white hair and beard, posture like a parade ground. He'd run a half marathon 2 months ago. He wasn't a man given a panic. He also wasn't a man who cried wolf. Let's test it, Sylas said. He unplugged a laptop from a TV. A princess cartoon froze on screen. Ilera had been here earlier. He set the laptop on the felt and started typing. The most elite families keep things quiet, but their public movements leave traces. Focus on 3. The Browns, the Abadi family, the Rouse family. They have members with trackable flight histories and public estates. He turned the screen to Magnus. A map lit up with a mark in the Appalachians. Is that the Browns' real address? Magnus nodded. Yes. Then if there's a return wave, high-profile members should be heading home. He searched Lucius Brown, Malachi Brown, Astra Brown, each at a recent flight into the region and nothing after. He switched tabs. Calebody, Asher Abadi, same pattern. Ragnar Rouse, Thorn Rouse, Draven Rouse. Same again. He didn't stop at 3 families. He checked a dozen, even smaller powerhouses. All roads led home, all within the last week. He closed the laptop with a soft click. I can't prove the reason, but the movement is real. We should go. Worst case, we come back Monday. Cedric's anger cooled to a frown. Magnus didn't gloat. He looked almost relieved that the data matched his warnings. That night, Sylas lay on his back, staring at a plain ceiling. His pulse was steady, but there was a brightness under it. Excitement? He hadn't felt that in a long time. Not for venomous snakes. Not for clean results. The world had been boring. Maybe this was the something bigger he never believed in. His door creaked. Alara peeked in, pink nightgown dragging at her ankles. "Fine," he said, smiling. "But you're getting too big for this." She dove into the covers and took half the bed like a tiny conqueror. His chest eased. "Sylas, am I going to see my friend again?" she whispered. "Maybe," he said after a beat. Mom and Dad said definitely. I knew they were lying. He huffed a laugh. He'd get scolded for that answer. "They'll be fine," he said. "Everyone might be fine. They might not be." His calculations said the odds were bad. But there was a path, and tomorrow they would start walking it. Sylas dipped his head and stepped off the private jet. Jeans, white turtleneck, loafers, light brown trench, simple, neat. The Appalachian wind should have been biting up here, but the air felt closer to spring than winter. The hot dog vendor's rant floated back through his mind. He kept walking. The Browns' estate sat high in the mountains, as remote as money could make it. Without a private runway, you'd need a commercial flight and a week of hiking to get near. The strip, hangar, and a small pilot's lodge were all that broke the tree line. A neat line of helicopters waited to ferry guests the rest of the way. After a word with the pilot, his father rejoined them, and they moved to the waiting area. All around, similar family groups clustered, well-off branches who drifted from the Browns over the years, now circling back. Sylas counted roughly 50 arrivals just in this window. A butler approached at a brisk clip, black hair, clipped beard, both flecked with gray. He bowed. "Welcome. I'm Joseph. Please follow me. I'll take you to your accommodations." Odd. Others had been here first, yet still waited on the tarmac. Priority treatment? Sylas glanced at his grandfather, who was barely hiding a grin. They boarded a helicopter and lifted off. 10 minutes later, they settled onto the roof of one of many homes scattered across the ridge. Alara claimed his lap and would have pressed her cheeks to the window if decorum hadn't stopped her. "This home will be your quarters," Joseph said as they descended. 5 bedrooms, 5 baths, an outdoor bathhouse with sauna and pool, and a large backyard. "If you want changes, tell me. I'll have architects draft plans immediately." Immediate architects. Extended stay, then maybe indefinite. "We miss brunch," Joseph went on. "I don't yet know all your preferences, so I've scheduled lunch at 1300. Lastly, there are questions I'm not qualified to answer. I'm told everything will be addressed tomorrow evening." He bowed again and slipped toward the service wing. The tour left little to ask, aside for the only questions that mattered. On those, they'd wait. The day moved faster than Sylas expected. Normally, the idea of a Sunday evening meeting with Monday lectures ahead would prod at him. He liked order, dressed well, things tidy, always on time. Tonight, the anxiety didn't land. His mind was fixed on a briefing. At the hour, they joined a slow stream along a groomed dirt path, so precise it might as well have been paved, through pines and cold, clean air. Other family groups emerged from their assigned houses, polite and a bit stiff. They shared blood on paper, not in feeling, and everyone had bigger thoughts than small talk. Sylas squeezed Alara's hand and kept pace, eyes open, taking stock. Tomorrow's answers had finally become tonight's.
Hey everyone, Firescale Audiobooks here. If there's a novel you'd love to hear more of, you can support us on Patreon or Ko-fi. Depending on your tier, I'll make extra parts just for the stories you're most excited about. Usually I can only upload 4 to 5 parts of each novel, but with your support we can go beyond that. And of course, don't forget to hit subscribe. It helps more than you know.
Sylas had been thinking about a great many things in the last day, and he felt that he had cobbled together some puzzle pieces. For one, just to make it here, one had to have a certain status, or at the very least be willing to take such a risk. A single flight hour for a pilot costed thousands. Even if you were near the estate, relatively speaking, you'd easily be 5 figures down the drain for this single trip, at best. No normal family could charter a plane on a whim like this. That was just the first filter, though. The second filter, and arguably the more important one, was daring to come in the first place. Objectively speaking, His grandfather's words were ridiculous. An apocalyptic event? Only known by the truest elites of the world? Next thing the old man would be saying was that the Illuminati was real too. However, even though it sounded ridiculous, there were countless methods of checking the veracity of the claim. Sylas' method was just one. If you knew what you were looking for, Sylas could think of at least half a dozen other viable methods. There might be some among the families that came today who were just looking to come up in the world. Maybe they thought the Browns would provide them an opportunity to soar beyond their current station. In Sylas' opinion, these people should be the minority. The rest were similar to himself, sharp-eyed and looking to satiate their curiosity. The families were led into a large dining hall, each assigned to their own tables. Separated again, Sylas noted. It was subtle, but there seemed to be a conscious effort to make it difficult for these various small families to interact with one another and start asking questions. Sylas didn't believe there was anything sinister about it, at least not yet. It was more likely to be a form of crowd control. A full 3-course meal was served, and the dining hall was filled with sounds of quiet chatter. Sylas' eyes landed on a few figures at the head tables, 3 in particular that he recognized instantly. Lucius Brown, Malachi Brown, and Astrid Brown, 2 men and a woman, each unique in their own way. They all shared one long table, facing the dining room, as though this was the Renaissance era and they were kings and queens. Oddly enough, they seemed to have no intention of addressing everyone. In a situation where everyone was meticulously following etiquette, this action, or inaction rather, stuck out like a sore thumb. Dessert was served, a nice light and airy cheesecake drizzled with strawberry jam. It looked delicious, though Sylas didn't eat it. He tended to stay away from sugar. He found that his body was a bit too sensitive to it. His little sister, though, happily stole away his piece. He really didn't know where this little munchkin found a room in that bite-sized body of hers. Someone stood from their seat. Sylas didn't need to look to know who it was. He had been focused on these people for the entire night. The moment his ears twitched, he knew it had to be Astrid. Astrid was about the same age as Sylas' mother, and their looks were so similar that they could easily pass as sisters. There were 2 women in their mid-40s that looked to be in their early 30s instead. Their style of dress was simple and elegant, and their choice in jewelry was muted and not very bombastic. Astrid wore a black gown that managed to not carry the gloominess one might expect. A pearl necklace graced her slender neck, and her hair carried quite a bit of volume, almost as though she had hosed it down with hairspray, and yet it didn't carry the expected stiffness as it loosely flowed to her shoulders. She was beautiful, but her brows carried an undisguised authority. There is a saying that most of the richest women in the world were widows or divorcees, but Astrid was neither, never having been married. She had every right to stand shoulder to shoulder with Lucius and Malachi. The 2 even seemed to defer to her somewhat. Not defer, Sylas thought to himself. More like they are content to let her take the lead. They see one another as equals. One interesting dynamic. What are they competing for that such a hierarchy is necessary? I know you all have many questions, so I will speak once for all of you. Though these words sound arrogant, the family needs you all to understand that the current ways of the world cannot continue as presently constructed. In the future, we will not all be equals. What you have must be earned, and only what you've earned can you use. Astrid's gaze swept through the dining hall. She was setting the tone, and her authority made it difficult for anyone to even think of refuting her. Earth has undergone 6 extinction-level events over the course of its history. The Ordovician extinction, the Devonian extinction, the Permian-Triassic extinction, the Triassic-Jurassic extinction, the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction, the Holocene extinction. Many frowned when they heard this. They were all educated people. They had heard of these extinction events in passing, though not many had heard of them in so many words. But those that had felt odd that they were being grouped together like this. The Holocene extinction, for example, was an extinction event currently ongoing, caused at the hands of humans and their impact on Earth's wildlife. Why mention these things? Your textbooks have told you that these extinction events were caused by various things. Volcanoes, ice ages, asteroids, countless horrible things. However, I am here to tell you today that this is all nonsense. Every one of these extinction events, even the so-called ongoing one, have all been caused by one single matter: the summoned Ascension. Astrid's expression became solemn. Many of you will choose to leave after tonight. I want to make it clear that the family will not stop you. We are not a charity, nor do we believe that those who carry our blood need such coddling. Once you step out of that door, there is no return. Whatever happens afterward will have nothing to do with us. We have no patience for turncoats. Parents, his little sister, his grandfather, Astrid, or even the other invitees. All of this was publicly available information, the kind of open secret you didn't even think about while walking through the streets every day. But Astrid's words just now, they made his heart start racing so long after it had finally calmed down. If after the sixth extinction event, Earth failed again, this time due to internal strife caused by cultural and racial differences, what better way to deal with that than to try to make everyone of one culture and one race? There is even now a universal language across all of Earth. It was a valiant effort, but humans were truly disgusting creatures. Without race, it became a matter of class. Wasn't the perfect example right here? The powerful families were gathering up now, and Astrid had mentioned bloodline once already. What about the poor? What about the people who didn't have a trillionaire-class family to suddenly call them back home? This will be our 7th attempt to ascend. There is much on the line, but I will keep this short. Every world only has 9 attempts to ascend. After failure on the 9th attempt, it will lose its right to sovereignty and will be passed on to the other overlords of their galactic region. Second, those of you informed about the past extinction events understand that we are quite lucky. Not all dominant species manage to survive an event. Many creatures of the past are no longer with us, the dinosaurs being the first that likely comes to your minds. The human race managed to make it through one extinction event, but it is impossible to guarantee that we can make it through another. Astrid waved a hand, and the dining room's lights dimmed somewhat as a projector began to fall to her back. Right now, all of you only have my words, and as I've said, I'm not here to coddle you all. But I do believe that it is only fair that you all get to witness exactly what me and my cousins have before you make your decision. The projector clicked into place, and an image fired onto it. No, it wasn't an image, but it was a bronze box that appeared, hovered, and rotated in space. Sylas frowned. He looked up at the ceiling and checked for wires. Then he went through all the magic tricks in the book to try to find the catch, but nothing came to him. This box is known as a city stele. Most accurately, a bronze city stele. It could be said that it's because our ancestor managed to survive the 6th extinction that we have this in our possession. In fact, this bronze city stele is without a doubt the most valuable possession of the Brown family. All of you touch it. The lights returned to normal, and the projector slid back up. Astrid pressed a hand against the bronze city stele, and it shot across the dining room to the first table. The wait was agonizing. Sylas had to sit there patiently, watching as one gaze after another lit up like a raging inferno. His leg began to move up and down, moving so fast that by the time the bronze city stele got to their table, his breathing was a bit rushed. Even so, he controlled himself, watching as his little sister eagerly leapt at it first, then his mother, then his father. Sylas, Sylas, Ilara pulled at his sleeve. It's so cool. It went like boom, then flash, and then all these words and letters appeared in my head like I was dreaming. But I wasn't dreaming. For the first time, Sylas completely ignored his little sister. His grandfather smiled, pushing the floating cube toward him without even taking a glance at it himself, his gaze carrying a hint of pleasure and a knowing look. Sylas reached forward and touched the cube, his mind going blank. No, it was like his mind and his body had been split in two, his mind seeing things that his body wasn't. Somehow, he was certain that whatever this was couldn't be seen by his eyes, but was rather his mind's eye instead. Like Ilara said, it felt like he was dreaming. And then the words came. Bronze City Stele. Status, Dormant. Village name, unnamed. Territory level, rudimentary village. Territory diameter, 100 meters. Residents, 0/100. Soldiers, 0/10. Popularity, 0 out of 0. Subsidiary village limit, 2. Territory stats. Basic amenities plus 5%. Basic limits plus 100%. Sylas was in complete awe. There was simply no technology on this level anywhere. Even VR gaming was still stuck in a projected image era. It was nowhere close to being able to send something right into your brain. There was some improvement on the front of being able to use computer chips to replace eyesight, but there was simply nothing like this. Basic amenities? Basic limits? What is that? Sylas' desire to understand everything was blazing like a bonfire. His curiosity was practically eating him alive. What he didn't expect was to get an answer. Basic amenities, crop output, village attraction, talent buff. Basic limits, territory diameter, residents, soldiers, subsidiary village limit. Sylas was stunned into silence, not by the response, but rather by what the response meant. It read my mind, and then responded in kind. How is that possible? He already knew from that moment that he wouldn't be returning home. The moon was full that night, tinged with a slight hint of blue that gave it an ethereal beauty. Sylas marveled at it, feeling that it held a different sort of significance today. It was no longer just a rock in the skies, a piece of earth stripped away and tied by gravity. Instead, it felt more like a stepping stone, or maybe even a distraction, obscuring what was beyond with its gorgeous light. Sylas felt someone sit by him. The stone bench had more than enough room, though it was odd that someone would be up so late at night. It was well past midnight. He usually liked to get to sleep on quite a strict schedule so that he could wake up early in the morning. People neglected sleep too often when it was probably the most powerful super serum in existence. But since he couldn't sleep either, who was to say that others wouldn't feel the same? "Grandfather," Sylas said lightly. Magnus smiled. By now, he was used to his grandson's stiff form of address. He knew Sylas' heart better than almost anyone else, so he wouldn't be caught up by such trivial things. "What are you thinking about, Sylas?" Sylas never took his eyes off of the moon. It wasn't that he couldn't answer, but that the answer would be too long and ultimately wouldn't get to the gist of what his grandfather wanted to talk about. "You've known for a long time," was what Sylas eventually said. Magnus sighed. It sounded aged and weary, and it was probably the first time his grandfather had truly exuded the presence of his age. "The fathers of Lucius, Malachi, and Astrid, they are my brothers. Compared to the other families brought here, it could be said that we are the closest to the main family in blood. Your father, he should have been the fourth among them. He, too, should have had the title of Grimblade." "Grimblade?" Sylas asked. "Yes, this is the name of our lineage. In order to better blend in with modern society, we changed our name to Brown. This is probably something that they will tell you in the coming days, but they already dumped enough on you." Sylas nodded slowly. Truth be told, this was much easier to accept now. If his grandfather had told him a few days ago, he might have tried to check him into a hospital. Grimblade, it was a rustic name, and the emotion it gave off could only be taken one of two ways. Either you would feel that it was the fantasy of a 5-year-old boy, or it was overbearing and valiant. Sylas was neutral. "All those years ago, it was my fault. I had a child with your grandmother, a woman that my father did not approve of. I withstood a great amount of pressure and slaved for the family to make up for this mistake." Magnus shook his head. "Ultimately, the result was me abandoning your father for 10 years and not being there when your grandmother died." Sylas looked toward his grandfather's side profile. He had never seen Magnus cry before. Even now, the latter's words were steady and even, but the tears continued to stream down his face in an uncontrollable flow. "To cancer. Imagine that, my woman, the love of my life, died to such a vile, detestable thing when her man came from the most powerful family in this world, when in just a few decades, such a disease could be cured with just a wave of the hand." Sylas knew that his grandfather must be referring to this coming. Summoned Ascension, they called it. Their world didn't have a cure for cancer, but this world seemed to. Magnus shook his head again. "When I got word of your grandmother's death, I abandoned the family and my birthright. My father forbade me from bringing Cedric back to the family, so we could only forge out on our own. And you feel no resentment? Sylas asked. Ah, Magnus laughed, his chuckle carrying a hint of darkness. Who would I resent? That man has long since died, and I didn't even attend his funeral. Even if I did hold some resentment, this family deserves a chance to survive. Why would I let my own pettiness get in the way when the culprit is gone? Sylas didn't respond, carefully listening to his grandfather's words. These matters had been on his chest for a long time, but no one would believe him. Even his own son didn't believe him. If Sylas looked at this from his father's perspective, it would seem like the Browns were obsessed with money and class to the point they carefully controlled the marriages of their descendants. But now that he had seen the bronze stele, it was a matter much deeper than that. This was truly a matter of life and death, with the fate of the entire human race on the line. Considering the name Grimblade, and the fact his grandfather called it a lineage, it might also mean that bloodline was incredibly important as well, and his grandfather's actions may have compromised that. With that perspective, everything was much more reasonable. Sylas spent a lot of time with snakes, carefully breeding them to select for beautiful patterns or more powerful venoms wasn't something only he dabbled in, but one that many other reptile enthusiasts and scientists alike took part in. If the matter of bloodline became so important in this new world as well, and on a much larger scale, he couldn't help but feel that the efforts their predecessors had gone through in eliminating race would all be for naught. But wasn't that the usual? The powerful making token gestures to the weak as they hoarded all the power for themselves? Anyway, this old man has already properly vented. Magnus patted Sylas' shoulder. This isn't what I came here to talk to you about. Instead, I want to speak to you about the bronze stele. You are sharp. I'm sure you've already realized that there's only one. Sylas finished. Magnus' smile widened, his teary eyes flashing with pride. He loved his family dearly, and this grandson of his never failed to impress him. Indeed, there is only one. There will only be one city lord, and the choice will only come from those three. Even if I hadn't made that mistake all those years ago, it would be your father, and not you, that would have an opportunity to compete for this chance. Sylas nodded. He wasn't surprised. The president of the United Coalition of Terra Nova had a minimum cutoff age of 35 years old. According to the science, Sylas' brain had only recently stopped growing, and he didn't have nearly enough life experience yet. Plus, while he was a tenured professor at such a tender age, what was that compared to 3 billionaires? If the Browns only had one city stele, and they were going to put their hopes in someone, even if it wasn't someone of the immediate family, it definitely wouldn't be someone as young as Sylas. Magnus chuckled. He knew that his grandson had a great deal of self-pride. It was reflected in the way he was so strict with himself and in his discipline. But he was also logical to a fault. He wouldn't be mad about something like this, even though Magnus knew Sylas only had one thought in his mind right now. I'm definitely the best choice. I can tell you what the plans of the family are in advance, and you can make the choice for yourself. If you go off on your own, though, I'm sure you can understand the consequences. This is a matter of life and death, so the punishment for dissension will be proportional. Sylas nodded. Even if Sylas proved himself to be a talent, the family would want him to consolidate under them and help. If he placed his efforts elsewhere, it would be as good as going against them. The city stele is the most valuable commodity in the Ascension realm. The most common of them are actually just titled common city stele. Over 99% of cities will be like this. Is that the reason for the buffers? Sylas asked. Yes. The bronze city stele is an upgrade, so it receives more territory per level, more residents, etc. However, the trial to gain one is excessive and heavy. For the Grimblade lineage to gain one of the bronze grade, it required a sacrifice they weren't willing to make until it was already clear that we would fail our 6th attempt. Sylas' brows rose slightly at these words, and his grandfather nodded in response. We lost thousands of warriors, and the lineage was almost completely wiped out, but it was only worth it because the extinction event was coming anyway. It was either we took the risk, or we would be buried. From these words, and for this level of sacrifice, it was obvious that the Browns, or the Grimblades, rather, could never give this city stele to a relative outsider like Sylas. They had given up too much. Soon, the summoned Ascension will begin, and this will be a period the family uses to evaluate which of the three will be most suited to becoming city lord. This period is also important because the location of your city is as important as anything else. The world changes? Sylas asked. Magnus laughed. Once again, his grandson had hit the nail on the head. Yes, the Ascension realm is randomized every time. The terrain, the ecosystems, even the dangers are always completely different. Even if they weren't, it would be very difficult for a comprehensive map to exist in the first place. Then what do you want me to do? Sylas asked. Magnus smiled bitterly. No, Sylas. This isn't something I'm strapping you with. I could just feel that this would be a choice you'd want to make, and I'm giving you my blessing to do so. If and only if you want to. Your father is a good man. I don't know how much credit I can take for that, but he isn't ambitious. He would be content to follow the plans of the family. Your mother is a good woman, and she will always support him well. The little munchkin is too young and won't even be among the summoned unless Cedric and his soul consent, and you know they won't. It's not that father isn't ambitious, Sylas said lightly. It's rather that he has no reason to be. He is easily content, and that's a good trait to have. Magnus agreed, but in this world, there really was no difference. If Cedric needed a trigger to become ambitious, by that point, it would already be too late. Either way, what I'm trying to say, Sylas, is that I am too old, and your parents don't have the necessary character. Although age will become far less of a factor very soon, by that point, much of the outcome will be decided, and it will no longer be my turn to decide things. You need to take this upcoming buffer period to figure out what you want to do. Sylas listened intently, and he and his grandfather spoke deep into the night. The days passed swiftly. Every day, a new meeting would take place, and the members of the family were briefed and prepared. However, it wasn't until the very last day that everyone learned of the weight of what they were about to do. This matter wasn't a joke, nor was it a game. It was one of the final opportunities they had to save planet Earth, and the risk was proportional. In these days, the family didn't train them. It was useless. What progress could someone with no fighting experience make in a mere week or so? Even Sylas knew that this was a great weakness of his. He was at best an amateur boxer, and that was if he was generous with himself. All he had in his favor was his athletic build and decent stamina. Sylas wondered why they wouldn't have just called him over sooner, but then he realized that they already had. They had spared as much resources as they were willing to on the matter. The members of the Grimblade's branch families, were mostly ill-prepared, but was the same true of Lucius, Malachi, and Astrid? What of their direct subordinates? This was a clear dividing line. Calling them back was for nothing more than bolstering their administration with those intelligent enough to know to return. Tonight, Lucius Grimblade began. You will be given two choices. The first choice will be to enter the ether plane, and the second will be to remain here. If you pick the first, you will be thrown into a trial world, one where you're ill-prepared and have a better than 90% chance of dying. If you choose the second, you will be giving up on this chance and will have another option down the line to subordinate yourselves to a city lord. The Grimblade family will not make this choice for you. Regardless of what choice you make, we will be of one family and of one mind. These are the last matters we need to explain to you. As for the rest, once the Ascension begins, everything else will fall into place. You are dismissed. Lucius' words were much more forceful than Astrid's, and he often spoke like a strict sergeant. His words were already laced enough with his intentions that he didn't need to make anything else clear. It was obvious the Grimblade family wanted them to choose the second option. Sylas lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling. He subconsciously looked at his phone, checking the string of missed calls and unopened emails that would have usually filled him to the brim with anxiety. But right now he was calm. Even though he had lied to his parents, to his little sister, even if he knew that death likely waited for him on the other side, he was calm. For the first time in his life, he was going to make the stupid, illogical decision. He had no combat experience, no hidden ace, nothing but the fragile brain squishing about in his skull. For some reason, his grandfather had known that he would make this choice, and he was probably the only one. His father and mother were so confident he would choose logic over the brashness of youth that they hadn't even bothered to have more than a casual conversation with him about it. Amusingly enough, his little sister was closer to his grandfather in this regard, and he had to assure her many times that he definitely wouldn't go. But he would go. He had to. He didn't have some savior complex, nor did he abhor the idea of being ruled by someone else so badly. After years in academia, he had gotten used to following rules, even when they were ridiculous. He had the discipline of a soldier. No, the real reason he was going was simply because he wanted to, because the idea filled him with excitement and pumped his cool blood with the heat a young man his age should have. Tick, tick. The clock on the wall seemed to slow before a blinding blue light rushed over the whole of Earth. If one observed the change from the moon, it would look as though a laser beam had suddenly collided with them, enveloping their entire world. And then the words appeared in his mind once again. Experiencing it for the second time, it felt so surreal. It was definitely only in his head, and yet with his eyes open, it felt like it had been inlaid into reality. Summon Ascension initiating. Summoned. Sylas Grimblade. Enter trial Ascension. Yes, no. Sylas lip curled. They made it sound so nice. Usually, a trial was supposed to be the easier version, the one where the training wheels would be on. But this was the exact opposite. In the trial Ascension, the world would be stripped of all basic amenities, akin to Earth long before modern day. After this trial Ascension was concluded, many helpful things would be added, such as system cities, where things could be conveniently bought and traded. These were all differences drilled into his head by the Grimblades, likely to ensure that he wouldn't make the choice he was about to make. Sylas smiled. Even if I die, I'm sure I'll see something interesting first. Yes. Sylas vanished. But Earth remained frozen in time, a state it would remain in until the trial Ascension was complete. Sylas appeared in a world of white. He didn't panic, as he knew exactly what this space was. Although the training Ascension had no training wheels, it didn't throw you out like bait to the sharks either. He knew his choice was stupid, but he also wasn't kicked in the head. If this chance didn't exist, regardless of how excited he was by the prospect, he wouldn't have come. A screen flashed before him. Name, Sylas Grimblade. Species, Human F. Affiliation, Grimblade Lineage. Class, Empty. Level, 0. Titles, Physical, 7. Strength, 5. Constitution, 5. Dexterity, 10. Speed, 8. Mental, 6. Intelligence, 5. Wisdom, 10. Charisma, 2. Will, 10. Luck, 1. Skills. Comprehensions. Gene state, rigid. Fragmented genes. Grimblade lineage, F. Common genes. Bronze genes. Silver genes. Gold genes. Legendary genes. Gene talents. Blade, aura, mutated, weakened. Sylas analyzed every line of this screen. This would be about the only place he could calmly do this. It would be the last chance he had for a while. Much of the information he used to analyze his stats came directly from his grandfather, as the Grimblades mostly spent time teaching them how dangerous the world on the other side was. For one, the stats of this Ascension realm weren't an objective metric of strength, but were rather relative stats. 10 represented the pinnacle of humanity, and 1 represented the bottom of the barrel. Essentially, any stats Sylas had a 10 and placed him in the 99th percentile. On average, you'd fall about 10 percentile points down for every loss of 1. This would become the new standard for the duration of the trial, and also a scale to help you understand just how much more powerful the surrounding creatures were. However, there were some exceptions, with intelligence, charisma, will, and luck being the main culprits. According to his grandfather, these were the only objective stats. Intelligence wasn't in regard to the normal definition of the word, but rather referred to one's ability to allow the flow of a special energy his grandfather called ether. This ability was mostly decided upon by your race and your genes. The human race was middle of the road in this sense, and the Grimblade lineage gene didn't help. Well, technically, the Grimblade lineage did help. The trouble was that it wasn't strong enough to add to the stat, especially not Sylas' weakened version. After all, He was 2 generations removed from the purest Grimblade bloodline. Charisma was similar and relied on race and genes. It wasn't a matter of looks or sweet-talking, but rather how well one could impose their will onto another party. Sylas apparently had high will, but he could not exert it onto others, at least not with any great effectiveness. He didn't have a methods to do so. What was the first one of these stats that Sylas had thought about that actually meant what it stated? It referred to a person's tenacity and mental toughness. For the moment, Sylas wasn't sure why the stat needed to be listed. It didn't seem as pertinent as the other stats, but he was sure that he would eventually find out. Finally, there was luck. It was the only stat that started off at 1 no matter who you were, what race you came from, or what genes you had. However, it was also the stat both most difficult and most important to improve. Sylas continued to scan the list. The physical stats were straightforward, with strength meaning strength, constitution referring to one's durability, dexterity one's flexibility, and speed one's, well, speed. The final of the mental stats, wisdom, was the one that focused on his IQ, his flexibility of mind, his ability to learn new things and adapt, as well as his EQ. There were only really 2 other things of interest on the screen, the first being his affiliation and the second being his gene talent. The fact his affiliation already said Grimblade lineage was something his grandfather had warned him about. Normally, by default, he should be unaffiliated. Because he had an affiliation meant the head of an affiliation could check in on him and his status. The good news was that this couldn't be done before the establishment of a city, and he would have time to shed this affiliation, though not without price. Abandoning your affiliation would activate a hidden line in the stat screen that would make things very difficult for him. His grandfather hadn't had more information than this, but he had been warned about it. Next, there was his gene talent. As expected, it was both mutated and weakened. The dash line was there because it wasn't even good enough to be F grade. As for what was beyond F grade, Sylas had no information about this. That aside, his grandfather had warned him about this as well. Magnus had a child with someone his father didn't approve of. And then, Sylas' father had a child with his mother, who was presumably also someone the Grimblades wouldn't approve of. It could be considered a small miracle that Sylas even had some portion of this gene talent. Sylas slotted these things to the back of his mind and then looked toward the 3 floating objects before him. The real reason he was in this world of white. He already knew what they were. One was the option to pick a weapon of his choice. The second was an option related to his genes, and the final was the option of a common city steal. Without hesitation, Sylas chose the second of the 3 options, and he felt something burrow into his body. This option wasn't for a new gene talent or even a gene upgrade. Rather, it would change his gene state. According to his grandfather, this would be the easiest method of changing his gene state. There would never be something so good obtained so casually again. Gene state represented one's ability to accept new genes into the body. The weaker the state, the more difficult it was to absorb genes and mutate existing ones. Rigid, inflexible, brittle, soft, flexible, malleable, chaotic, and finally free. These were the available gene states. At rigid, it was impossible for you to change anything about your genes no matter how many chances you had. At free, your body was practically like clay in your hands, ready to change and be molded to your wishes. This gene state enhancer would allow him to have a soft gene state for a 1-week period before wearing off. In that state, any gene he absorbed would have a 50% chance of being successful. Now it was a question of if he would manage to get his hands on any. Sylas felt his vision blur once again, and soon the world took shape around him. It was a forest, dense and humid. Overgrown vegetation was ubiquitous, and the sun had a hard time penetrating the ground from the high skies above. Sylas took this in with no small bit of satisfaction. If he had spawned in an area without cover, his odds of dying would be much higher. He looked down at himself and found that he was wearing a cheap set of light brown clothing, made of thin cotton. There was a distinct lack of shoes on his feet, which made the moist soil particularly grating on his psyche, and he wasn't adorned with anything else special. According to his grandfather, The spawn point shouldn't have any significant predators within about a kilometer or so. Of course, the moment you touch down, these predators would no longer be restricted by such rules. So, caution was the name of the game. Weapon. This was the first thing Sylas' mind went to. His grandfather hadn't told him which of the three options to pick. It was only after much deliberation that he made the choice he had. It was the riskiest, but it was also the one with the greatest growth potential. If he had chosen the city steel, he would have been given free warriors to fight on his behalf. The benefit of a weapon was obvious as well. It could be said that this was the only option that didn't really give him any method of protecting himself. Sylas began to move, getting a lay of the land. He had to take advantage of this buffer to try to see if he could find any usable landmarks. Water, shelter, a natural fort potentially, all of these were things on his mind as he continued to move. In addition, though, he was also paying attention to potential markers that denoted territory. Claw marks, footprints, dung, anything he could take note of. On the way, Sylas picked up 2 stones. He flexed his arms and bashed them together with his greatest strength, ignoring the aching in his wrist until they broke into pieces. He let them drop to the floor and picked out the one that both fit nicely in his palm and had a decent edge to it. He was lucky that there were no beasts around, and this rainforest was an excellent muffler of noise, or else he would likely not dare to do this. Running water. Sylas' ears picked it up, and he looked in that direction. He crouched down and leaned over a thick bush to take a look at the clearing. He had traveled about 200 or so meters. There were no creatures in sight, at least not immediately. A few seconds later, Sylas felt his heartbeat slow as a large elk came into view. That elk, it's at least 2 meters tall. It should be an extinct species. Mental surpasses target. Analysis successful. Irish elk F. Level 0. Physical 14. Mental 0. Will 3. Sylas was a biochemist with a doctorate, but he wasn't well informed on every extinct species to ever live. What he did know was that elk didn't come with bodies that large and antlers so expansive. Even so, this was something he had expected. According to his grandfather, the trial Ascension wouldn't spawn creatures of other worlds, but rather ones pulled from Earth itself, extinct or otherwise. Considering there was a large number more of species that had gone extinct versus ones that were still among the living now, almost all the creatures that Sylas met should be among the first number. A mental of 0. Sylas remained hidden and continued to observe. The body of water before him was a lake about 30 or so meters across. There was a stream that connected to it, expanding into a river that ran through the forest. But this should be the main body of water these creatures use to hydrate themselves. Sylas made a mental note of it and made a move to follow the elk as it finished up. A mental of 0 meant that the elk should be unable to use ether. As they continued through the trial Ascension, this would change, and these creatures would become more dangerous. Its physical was unsurprisingly far ahead of Sylas. Double, in fact. The stats were scaled to human levels, so it was easy to tell just how much more powerful even an unenhanced creature was compared to the average human. Sylas was patient. Although the looming deadline of a week was practically ticking above his head, he knew that being rash would just get him killed. He followed a long way behind the elk and often couldn't see it in his line of sight. He focused instead on its hoof prints, maintaining caution as his #1 priority. Elks were creatures he vaguely understood. Since this one was a male, it would likely sleep alone. All he had to do was wait for the opportunity and hope another creature didn't interfere with him. Luckily, it seemed that this elk had a strong dominion over the immediate area. It meandered about, eating vegetation here and there, marking its territory with its dung from time to time, and all around asserting itself. Sylas should have been bored to death. Having been born and raised in a world of smartphones and social media, following a creature without cognition strong enough for even this system to register should have been draining. Even so, in a place where slacking off even once could cost him his life, he somehow managed to remain completely focused. Not only did he follow the elk as it moved about, he kept a constant vigilance of his surroundings, even carefully avoiding any creatures unlucky enough to appear close enough to the elk. The hours ticked by, and his patience never wavered, even as the sun began to set and darkness descended. Sylas' eyes narrowed when he saw the notification alerting his mind. He felt that it would be a bit dangerous if this happened in a situation where he needed hyperconcentration, but he could only make do for now. The title system was something else his grandfather had told him about. In general, a title's rareness could be decided by the kind of boost it gave. The fact that this one could even increase the odds of absorbing genes, even if it was only genes of a specific type, meant that it was on the rarer side. Interestingly enough, titles that gave boosts to hidden stats like dexterity rather than overall stats like physical or mental were on the more common side of things. The fact that this title checked both boxes told Sylas that he would have to weigh several things in the future. He found it odd that titles didn't come with grades like much everything else seemed to, but he took it in stride. After all, he had other things to focus on right now. Night fell, but by dusk, the elk had already found a region to sleep. This is odd, Sylas thought to himself. The sleeping pattern was too human. Most animals didn't fall into a normal human-like sleep pattern. Sylas wasn't sure of the exact sleep pattern of elks, but he felt that the fact it was going to rest at this time was peculiar. Even after the elk had fallen asleep, Sylas continued to wait. After about a quarter hour, he noticed something interesting. An energy fell down from the skies and matched the steady breathing rhythm of the elk. Ether, Sylas concluded as he put two and two together. He wasn't being schemed against by this elk. Its intelligence was that of a normal animal. It was impossible for it to lure him into a trap. Rather, it seemed that this system might have forced these beasts into uncharacteristic routines so that they could be evolved over time while they slept. This way, every day, they would grow stronger. Now or never. Sylas never hesitated when he made a decision, especially not one with such high stakes. The elk had done all the heavy lifting for him. This region was about as secluded as you could get in this dense forest. If he waited for the elk to evolve first, he didn't know if his plan would work. In the depths of the night, it was almost impossible to see. The sun could hardly penetrate the thick foliage in the day, let alone the moon now. However, the gentle rain of ether, though subtle, was just enough for Sylas to know where he was going. That, and the fact he had carefully scouted out this region in the day as well, prepared him for this eventuality. He burst into action and appeared behind the elk. He guessed that even if he made some noise, the likelihood that the elk would awaken mid-evolution was next to nil. Even so, he remained as stealthy as he could, rushing in from the back of the sleeping creature. At that moment, something inside him stirred. It was something that he had stealthily tested throughout the day, his blade or a gene talent. The stone he held in his hand gained a subtle twinge of something special as he leapt onto the back of the elk and swung for its skull at the same time. The sound of bone splintering echoed. Dexterity was a stat that decided not just one's flexibility, but also how effectively one could use their strength and speed. The antlers of the elk were large, and they provided great cover. However, even while swinging with all his might, Sylas Stone managed to find a way through just the slightest gap, driving down with a strong force. The pulse of pain woke the elk. A cry that sounded like a mix between a cow's moo and a whale's roar echoed out. Sylas frowned. His plan was to end it in a single strike. His blade, aura, might be weaker than a true-blooded Grimblade should be, and his weapon might be hardly considered a weapon at all, but it should have been enough. The ether. This was the only conclusion that made sense. Even though the evolution was incomplete, it had already had such an exaggerated effect. Sylas tightly bound his thighs to the back of the elk and held onto one of its branching antlers with his free hand. Using the latter as leverage, he raised his hand axe into the skies and drove it down again. At that moment, he felt an unprecedented calm. Even when he thought about having to kill a living, breathing animal with a weapon as crude as a hand axe, he didn't flinch away from it. He simply felt that it was a necessity. There was no need to question it. The elk rushed up, its will for survival burning bright, and yet it was too disoriented and foolish to understand where the danger was. Its body flared with an unknown energy, and all it knew was that there was pain coming from its head. It lowered its antlers, nearly throwing Sylas off its back completely as it rushed headfirst toward tree. It missed. Sylas' first 2 blows were enough that it couldn't control its body properly anymore, and it ran by the tree instead, its right set of antlers getting clipped on the bark and causing its neck to be ripped to the side. In this moment, Sylas noted several things. For one, the body of the elk was already much stronger than it should be. Its speed and acceleration were greater than what he had observed before, but its durability hadn't caught up. The violent force of its antlers being caught in the tree broke off a large segment of it and worsened its injuries. However, it also put Sylas in danger. His legs were currently clamped around the neck of the elk. If it had a close shave with another tree, there was no doubt that he'd lose one of his legs, or maybe them both at this kind of speed. As fast as his mind was moving, Sylas knew that he couldn't jump off now. The elk was definitely in its death throes, but with ether as a variable, who knew how far it could run? How many animals would it alert? More importantly than that, wouldn't he lose the right to benefit from its corpse if it disappeared into the distance? He had wasted an entire day waiting for this opportunity. He only had 7 of them before his soft gene state wore off. There was no room for error. He raised his hand again as another tree swiftly approached, but this time he forgot everything. There was just the blade in his hand and the spot of red on the elk's skull. In the night, his pair of green eyes sparkled like gems, and then his hand axe descended. The crack was resounding, the stone blade in Sylas' palm even splitting once more as the elk collapsed, skidding along its front knees before one of its antlers was caught in the ground, sending Sylas flying off. Sylas' shoulder rolled forward, and he popped back up swiftly. The first thing he did was scan the area. It was hard to see anything at all, so he listened carefully. His breathing was even, and his heartbeat was slow despite the situation he had been in. Everything felt slow as the seconds ticked by, but ultimately there was nothing. It seems that the night might come with some extra safety. It would be best to be nocturnal in this situation, but if I sleep in the day where the animals are most active, won't I put myself in danger? Sylas had already not slept for over a day. He hadn't had anything to drink either, and other than some bugs he had conveniently eaten while stalking the elk, he hadn't had anything to eat either. He wasn't worried about food. This was a matter of survival, so he wasn't grossed out by eating insects if he had to. In addition, he had a good understanding of what was and wasn't poisonous in terms of the plant life after observing the elk for a day. However, fatigue wasn't something he could ignore. Sylas shrugged this off for now and walked to the elk, putting a hand on it. Irish elk. Gene detected. Fragmented gene. Speed F. Attempt assimilation? Yes, no. Titled genes like the Grimblade family's Grimblade lineage were on the rarer side. Most genes were like this one, bolstering a certain aspect of one's physical stats. Between titled genes and physical genes like this one, there were attribute genes which were a little rarer and could give one control over a certain type of ether or other mysterious abilities. The rarest genes of them all, though, were genes that could grant gene talents. His grandfather had been very vague about any more specifics than this, but he had said that the world of genes and how one could learn to use and manipulate them were endless. It was a topic that there was the least amount of information on, and yet one should strive to learn the most about. Regardless, physical genes had their usefulness as well, that being that they were the easiest kind of genes to stack. So long as they shared the same name, they could be fused. In addition, they were repeatable. In this forest, it was doubtful that there'd only be a single elk. In that case, it should be true that so long as he kept killing elks, he would continue to get the speed gene. Yes, Sylas held his breath. For the first time, he actually felt some of his nerves getting to him. He hadn't felt nervous jumping into this death trap. He hadn't felt nervous stalking an animal that could kill him with a few kicks. He hadn't even felt nervous when he moved to strike it dead. But this 50-50 chance he was staring down right now had a lot riding on it. He had wasted an entire day on this elk, just for this chance right here. That was already one of his 7 days. If he let the 7-day timer run out, he would be back to a rigid gene state and have a 0% chance of absorbing any genes. Well, aside from that unexplained 10% boost his title gave him. To make matters worse, after seeing how powerful the elk got after just an incomplete evolution, just how much worse would his situation be tomorrow when he was surrounded by an entire forest worth of animals that had actually completed theirs? Gene assimilation starting. Gene assimilation failed. Sylas stared at the screen for a long time before slowly closing his eyes. He took a deep breath. When he opened them again, his calm was just the same, and he moved on. A 50-50 chance was good odds, but ultimately, by definition, they were good odds of failing as well. His title boost hadn't kicked in, something he could subconsciously tell, so the elk wouldn't be the best bang for his buck either. He needed to shift his attention. If he wallowed in his own misery, he would just be waiting for death. The first thing he did was look toward the elk's corpse. It would be good food, but it was impossible for him to make use of it. The greatest benefit of this dead elk right now is that he should be able to make use of its territory to get some sleep of his own in. He looked at the broken antlers before walking forward and picking up some of the pieces. An elk's antlers were incredibly sturdy. They were the naturally forged weapons of the creature. The fact they broke like this was one part coincidence, and another part due to the elk's evolution. Considering the fact it gave me a speed gene, that meant its evolution tended toward that aspect. It should mean that its speed stat overwhelmed its constitution stat, which is why running into the tree like that caused its antlers to break. Another secondary point was the sturdiness of the trees themselves. Their leaves didn't even rustle after the impact. This is good. Sylas found what he was looking for. An antler with a particularly sharp point. Blade aura could only be applied to a weapon. His hand didn't seem capable of withstanding the gene talent without a great amount of pain. It had felt like he stuck his hand in a microwave when he tried. In addition, blade aura seemed to only be as good as the medium through which it was used. The hand axe was too inferior, and it took several solid blows before Sylas could kill the elk. Part of that was due to it being in a half-evolved state, but as Sylas had already concluded, constitution wasn't the elk's strong point. This sharp antler, however, was a far better conduit. Even so, it wasn't Sylas' goal. Bending down, Sylas channeled blade aura again before using the sharp and to begin carefully carving around the elk's leg. His target was the elk equivalent of the human femur. The femur was the strongest bone in the body, and though Sylas wasn't an expert on elks, he assumed that there was some decent crossover here too. If this bone wasn't the strongest one in the elk's body, it wouldn't be far from it. Sylas suddenly felt a wave of fatigue, but he had already expected this. It would be foolish to assume that he could just use blade aura indefinitely without any consequences. Even so, he had already succeeded. Using his high dexterity, he targeted the soft flesh around the hind hip bones of the elk and took one of its legs. Then he hauled it over his shoulder and rushed back to the elk's original territory. As he moved, he thought about another problem he was facing: blood. During the day, he hadn't come across any carnivorous creatures, but that didn't mean there weren't any. The death of the elk could attract them, and the leg he was taken was not only heavy, it could also bring him burdens in other ways as well. He would have to be fast. Sylas returned to the core of the elk's territory. Even in the midst of that adrenaline-filled situation, he hadn't lost his head, and he made careful note of exactly where the elk was running. During the day he spent stalking the elk, he had learned a lot about blade aura. The rundown was simple. He could only use it a minute at a time before needing 10 minutes of rest. He couldn't apply it directly to his flesh without being assaulted by a strong burning sensation. While he didn't push himself to see if this would lead to permanent structural damage, when he did test it on a leaf, it shriveled and basically burnt to a crisp. That led him to conclude that there was a certain level of agitation going on that organic material couldn't handle, and this was especially so for organic material with high water content. Beyond that, blade aura running out felt similar to how he felt at the end of a half marathon. He was out of breath, his body ached, and he felt like taking a long rest. However, unlike the end of a half marathon, he recovered much faster. Sylas' stat screen didn't have his stamina stat, but his assumption was that stamina was baked into constitution. He felt that he was a decent long-distance athlete, but this system didn't seem to approve of that analysis. though it was hard to tell without understanding how well others fared. Sylas patiently waited for the 10 minutes to be up before he went at it again. It took him over an hour to undergo this repetitive cycle again and again before he finally succeeded in cutting out the elk's femur, a much more complicated process than just cutting off the leg. Sylas frowned. I miscalculated. Judging by the weight of the bone, it exceeded 10 pounds. That was heavier than a long sword and was precisely the kind of burden that Sylas couldn't afford to lug around. In a dangerous situation, this would be the first thing he abandoned, and that was not the hallmark of a good weapon. It seemed that this situation was getting to him, after all. He wouldn't normally overlook something like this. Now, he was filthy, covered in blood that was probably its own ticking time bomb, and didn't have anything decent to show for it. No, this is still salvageable. There wasn't much night left, and Sylas had to give himself at least 4 hours of sleep. That was his minimum requirement. He had to pivot and find a new path forward. He pulled out the tendons of the leg and placed them high on a nearby tree branch to dry. He just hoped the humidity wouldn't ruin that chance completely. Then, he brought the femur over to a stone. Trying to grind a bone down when it had yet to be purged of its water content was a nightmare. Sylas didn't have to be a wilderness junkie to know this. However, the quirk of his blade, aura, just might become useful here. Sylas bet that if he used blade aura on bone, he could speedrun the evaporation of its moisture content and likewise get rid of the marrow within, not much unlike the leaf he had burnt ash earlier in the day. The bone was thick. If it was dry, he could probably split it in two and sharpen it with greater ease. On top of that, if it lost its moisture content, there was a good chance that it wouldn't be so heavy anymore. Unfortunately, he couldn't use this to speed up the drying process of the tendons. The tendons were just like his hand, being formed entirely of flesh. These deductions flowed through Sylas' mind like a river. He felt more at peace, and his worries rushed away. Another hour ticked by, and Sylas breathed out heavy breaths. He had succeeded. From one 10-pound bone that would have been no more than a burden, he now had two split halves that weighed about 3-ish pounds each. Each half was about 3/4 of a meter long, and their width had a curve to them. Since bones were obviously hollow, this was an expected result. Thanks to his blade aura, they were perfectly dry as well, allowing him to use the nearby stone to sharpen them both into a point. Although they couldn't exactly be called spears, the longer length should give him some extra leeway. After some thought, Sylas stored one in a safe place and rushed out into the forest again, his eyes sharp. There was still time. He gave himself an extra hour, and his goal was clear: find another sleeping beast to target. Sylas had been thinking about this matter for a long while, and he felt that it was impossible that he could just continue to benefit from this loophole. If you could just hide during the day and target sleeping animals at night, he didn't believe his grandfather would describe this as such a dangerous endeavor. He realized, then, that this night might be a one-off chance. How many would stalk a single elk for an entire day and even wait until it fell asleep like he had? In most cases, humans would be taking this opportunity to sleep themselves, having spent much of the first day acclimating themselves and finding shelter. In addition, moving around in the rainforest at night was almost impossible. The moonlight was sparse, and you could hardly see a few meters ahead of you. No one would choose to run around in this environment. But that was exactly why Sylas had to. It was precisely in this darkness that it would be possible to spot the descent of ether. He remembered it well. It had a slightly bluish tint, different from the moon's silvery light. It was subtle, but it still stood out somewhat in this dark forest. Right now, he was banking on his luck. No, it wasn't luck. In a forest of this size, the concentration of wildlife should be exceptional. As expected, it didn't take even 10 minutes for Sylas to find a cascade of ether. This one, however, made him freeze. A python, one extinct for ages, hung high in the trees. Its 12-meter-long body looped again and again, carrying such mass that it looked to be a miracle that the tree could hold it up at all. Sylas had only just thought that he hadn't seen a single carnivore in the region, only to find one mere minutes from his original location. Goosebumps erupted across his skin. Without the slightest hesitation, he decisively left. This was not a creature he wanted to get entangled with. As a researcher, he mostly worked with venomous snakes and rarely constrictors like this one. However, he had just as much healthy respect for them as the former. This was about the worst kind of extinct creature he could meet, other than maybe dinosaurs themselves. The only good news was that pythons of that size were very slow. But the fact it's physical was that high despite what was likely low speed and dexterity meant that its strength and constitution must be off the charts. This was in part due to the ether, Sylas was sure. But its evolution wasn't even over yet. Sylas made a note to himself that his scouting abilities weren't perfect. He was human, and he could only use his eyes. He wasn't the only creature that could blend into the environment, and he was definitely the worst suited to doing so on top of that. Soon, Sylas found another cascading waterfall of ether. Red Fox F. Level 0. Physical 17. Mental 0. Will 1. Red foxes should be mostly nocturnal, but it's asleep. This is a plus for my theory about the ether. The high physical stat threw Sylas off, but at this point he had pretty much confirmed that this was the benefit of ether. As the night went on, these creatures would only get stronger. By tomorrow, he would be surrounded by superhuman-level beasts, and his odds of surviving would only plummet. He moved slowly, making sure to carefully check around the region to ensure that there were no other lurking dangers like the titanoboa. Then he exploded into action. He raised the femur spear up, activating blade, aura, and preparing to stab down. But then his heart skipped a beat. Time seemed to slow. The first thing he noticed were the twitching ears of the red fox. As Sylas' steely green eyes rushed through the night, they picked up on every detail, each one more of a flashbang to his senses than the last. First it was its ears, then its tail swayed, and by the time Sylas loomed over it, it had hopped to its feet, spinning around with a sharp glint in its eyes. Another mistake. Sylas was being hard on himself, but that was how he always was. Even so, he didn't slow down or hesitate as he pierced downward. The fox's body blurred, moving so fast that Sylas' eyes almost couldn't keep up in the darkness. But he still felt something connect. A yelp came from the fox as a deep gash was torn into its front left shoulder. Sylas felt its intention to run away immediately. Remembering its will stat, Sylas put 2 and 2 together, realizing that this might be a method of telling the tendencies of these creatures as well. This timidity only benefited Sylas. The red fox turned in an attempt to run, but its injured front leg threw its balance off, and it stumbled. Precisely what Sylas was waiting for. He raised up the femur spear again and drove it down, this time right through the spine of the red fox. Another yelp echoed, but it was pinned to the ground, and its strength was quickly leaving its body. Sylas retreated. With its spine damaged, the fox couldn't run away, but that didn't mean it couldn't try to harm him in some way. It was better safe than sorry. He watched as the red fox breathed its last, his green irises floating in the darkness like eerie orbs of death. Walking forward, he placed a hand on the red fox. Red fox. Gene detected. Fragmented gene. Dexterity F. Attempt assimilation? Yes, no. Sylas accepted the assimilation. He wondered if, since this was a dexterity gene, it would also mean that his title would activate. Dexterity had been quite useful to him until now, and it appeared in subtle ways. The more he thought about these stats, the more he felt that they had multiple layers to them. For example, just now he used all his strength but still managed to drive the femur spear exactly where he wanted it to go. Someone else's accuracy might have been lacking in that rushed moment. As expected, Sylas did feel his title take effect, and he got a 10% boost to his success. Gene assimilation starting. Gene assimilation triggered. Sylas felt his body seize up for a moment before relaxing. Gene assimilation successful. No wonder there's a choice. If I seize up like that at a bad time, I could die. It's likely that the more intrusive the gene, the worse the experience will be. Sylas exhaled a breath. He might have been successful, but he didn't forget about the fox waking up as soon as he approached. He didn't think that was a coincidence. It shouldn't be that the fox had a special ability, though that was a small possibility. Sylas was more inclined to believe that it had been startled awake, maybe even by the ether itself. Maybe it wouldn't be as easy as he thought to take advantage of this loophole. There's only one way to find out. Sylas went back on the hunt, but this time he was looking for another creature similar to the red fox, preferably small and weak, with abilities that skewed more towards speed or dexterity. Red Fox F. Level 0. Physical 18. Mental 0. Will 2. Sylas hid behind a tree, and the first thing he did was throw a rock. It soared just over the ears of the red fox. It didn't react. Sylas prepared another rock. This time, he threw it similarly, allowing it to soar just over the head of the red fox. However, he took a lot of power off of it. The rock fell just a meter or two away from the red fox, landing in the soft grass. It still didn't react, as though it was too lost in its dreams. Is it really because of me? The noise of that rock wasn't significantly softer than his footsteps had been. After some more thought, Sylas picked up a larger rock, about 2 inches in width. He threw it again, but this time at a tree on the opposite side of the clearing the red fox was sleeping in. Once again, it didn't react. I see. There was no way to tell for certain unless he moved forward himself, but it was as he feared. The animal was shaken awake by his appearance specifically. It must be the case that the Irish elk didn't react to me because it had only just started its evolution. He wasn't sure. He had managed to land a hit on the elk before it woke up, but these foxes, a gamble. Once again, the moment he made the choice, he acted. He burst through the clearing. Adrenaline pumped through his body as he raised the femur-short spear. The moment he got within 3 meters, he sensed it all again. The twitch of the ears, the sway of the tail. But this time, it was all just a little bit faster. Even so, while the stats of this red fox were better, Sylas was far more prepared. He threw a rock as hard as he could with his offhand. For as long as he could remember, he had been able to use his left and right hands interchangeably, and at this moment, it came in handy. This rock was easily 4 inches in diameter, and it had a great heft to it. It slammed down on the head of the red fox just as it tried to get up. The fox's spin was delayed by just a half measure, allowing Sylas the time he needed to thrust down with the femur-short spear. It was all so perfectly laid out. Unfortunately, Sylas was quickly learning that not everything in this world was under his control. The fox's hair suddenly stood on end and its body shivered. In that split moment, it looked almost as though it had caught about a cold fever. Sylas' short spear stabbed down and hit nothing but air. The red fox seemed to phase through it, appearing just a meter to the side. For Sylas, who had based his whole life on logical deduction, he felt as though his senses had short-circuited. What just happened? An almost cat-like growl echoed as the fox bared its teeth towards Sylas. With quick movement, Sylas pulled the short spear out of the soft grass. His offhand pulled out the elk antler piece, clutching it tightly as he faced off against the fox. The good news? He had confirmed that this system wouldn't allow him any more easy kills. Last time, he had been within 2 meters before the fox reacted. This time it was at 3. As these evolutions continued, he bet that the range would only extend and he would only get more and more helpless. The bad news? As though the good news wasn't tinged with enough angst, he now had to actually face off against this animal head-to-head without any tricks to rely on. Oh, and his blade or his timer was already ticking. Sylas could distinctly hear the rhythm of his breath, the crunching of the grass beneath his bare feet, and the slight rustle of the chilly wind felt amplified 100-fold. His usually steady and calm heart sped up, blood rushing through him and flushing his skin red. He was completely on high alert, the tingling sensation of his small hairs rising to attention and goosebumps crawling up his skin feeling as visceral as a sudden dump in a cold lake. Even as he circled the red fox, he realized that it was hesitant to attack as well. Its body continuously shivered, as though it was hesitating between running away and charging forward to rip Sylas' throat out. At that moment, Sylas keenly remembered the cowardice of the first fox he had come across. It hadn't even tried to fight back. This one had a will that was slightly stronger, but it seemed that cowardice was ingrained into its very bones. The moment Sylas made this deduction, he realized he needed to take the initiative. He spread his arms out wide, revealing the most vital parts of him to attack as he swept toward the red fox. The small creature froze for a moment, distinctly feeling just how much larger Sylas was than it. The fox wasn't even half a meter from its paws to its shoulders, its overall body length not even reaching an entire meter. Compared to Sylas, who was well over 6 feet, it was truly small. Sylas' approach could only be said to be crude beyond compare. He distracted the red fox with his arms, flailing them out and flashing his pair of bone weapons. Then, in that final moment of approach, his leg flashed. The red fox's eyes were darting between the bone weapons and didn't even seem to notice as a foot hit it flush in the jaw. Sylas' jaw set into a flex position. He had a working understanding of the common martial arts, but kicking against something with his bare feet, that wasn't something that he was used to by any stretch of the imagination. The red fox released a yelp. First a stone had hit the back of its skull, and now a strong kick from an existence over 20 times heavier than it had sent it flying. How could it not feel the aftereffects? As Sylas had expected, the physical of the red fox was only so high due to its main stat, dexterity. In addition, it seemed that the odd move it had used before wasn't something it could use continuously. It probably had decent speed as well, but agility would definitely be its strong suit, maybe even acceleration. The more Sylas thought about it, the more he felt that the stat system wasn't nearly comprehensive enough. There should be more to it, but none of those thoughts slowed his movements. He rushed after the red fox as it rolled across the grass, slamming into a nearby tree before it could go too far. It tried to scurry to its feet, but the impact with the tree threw off its timing, and right then, Sylas swept in. He pierced down with his femur-short spear. It was then the red fox did something that was out of Sylas' calculations once again. Its tail whipped against the tree, giving it the extra balance it needed to swiftly dodge. Sylas' short spear barely grazed against its ear, drawing blood and nearly cutting it in two. The fox leapt backward and let out an enraged yelp before leaping right at Sylas' head. Its agility was simply beyond common sense. Sylas hadn't even retracted his hand from the first pierce. His body was off balance, and the only saving grace was that the fox was facing his body from a narrow angle. Sylas tried to force himself to spin out of the way, but he wasn't nearly as agile as the fox. At the very least, his own dexterity stat seemed far more focused on accuracy and control. The fox bit into his shoulder, angrily tearing into it with its teeth. The jolt of pain shot through Sylas' body, and his mind went blank. In his life, he had never broken a bone, he never suffered any severe wounds. He had never even had any close run-ins with death, even given all the rare snakes he worked with. This could be said to be the worst sort of pain he had experienced in his life, and it came from a small creature with a maw so small it couldn't even properly get a hold of even his relatively lean shoulder. Even the bite marks were hardly a couple of centimeters deep. An odd feeling welled up in his heart as time seemed to slow around him. It was one part humiliation, another part a reality check, and a final part, excitement? His opposite hand suddenly flashed over with the antler blade. His blade aura was just about to tick down to 0, but there was still just enough left to drive it right through the eye socket of the fox. The red fox released in panic, but it couldn't dodge as it fell to the ground. Sylas raised his injured arm and drove the short spear right through the throat of the red fox. His blade aura blinked out, and a wave of fatigue hit him. He took deep breaths, standing there with his shoulder pooling with blood. His heartbeat was no longer calm, beating like a drum in his chest. Every pump seemed to force more blood out of his shoulder and reverberate through his very bones. It took a long while before he calmed down. Just what was that rush? Red fox. Gene detected. Fragmented gene. Dexterity F. Attempt assimilation? Yes, no. Sylas didn't forget himself entirely. He couldn't stay here for long. He had some worries about whether that fox had rabies. If it did, he would be in trouble. But he felt that he should be safe unless this system spawned viruses as well. For all of these extinct creatures to suddenly return, they had to have been recreated by some unknown method, maybe a far more advanced kind of cloning than the people of Earth had access to. In that case, unless they were also being needlessly cruel, there shouldn't be a reason to release viruses along with that. That wouldn't preclude new viruses from manifesting on their own, but he could at least hope that he wouldn't be that unlucky. Gene assimilation starting. Gene assimilation triggered. Sylas felt his title activate once again. Gene assimilation successful. Gene talent detected. Trade 10 fragmented dexterity F to unlock. Sudden burst? Yes, no. Sylas' brows raised. He hadn't expected to run into such a thing so quickly, but he could only choose no. He didn't have 10 gene fragments in total, let alone 10 of this particular kind. It would also be a hard pill to swallow, even if he had the opportunity. After all, losing 10 gene fragments would also mean losing all the stat boosts that came with it. Name, Sylas Grimblade. Species, Human F. Affiliation, Grimblade Lineage. Level, 0. Titles, A Patient Stalker. Physical, 8. Strength, 5. Constitution, 5. Dexterity, 13. Speed, 8. Mental, 6. Intelligence, 5. Wisdom, 10. Charisma, 2. Will, 11. Luck, 1. Gene state, soft. Fragmented genes. Grimblade lineage, F. 2. Dexterity, F. Gene talents. Blade, aura, mutated, weakened. Sudden burst, dormant, F. Each fragmented dexterity gene had given him a +1 to his dexterity stat. If he wanted to awaken sudden burst, he would need to give all of that up. He had been lucky, getting 2 successes in a row, but the failure of the elk was still looming over his head. There probably wouldn't be such a good chance to kill an elk that easily again, either. Unlike the red foxes, the elks outmassed him. If he got caught by an elk like he had the red fox just now, instead of a few shallow wounds, it would have been broken bones at best. In this environment, he couldn't afford such devastating injuries. The good news was that, according to his grandfather, just the existence of ether within him allowed wounds to heal much more quickly. An injury that would usually take weeks to heal might only take a few days now. Even so, those few days were too valuable to him right now. His soft gene state would end soon. I need to target small animals, ones that are at best 10% of my body weight, at worst 50%, until I have the strength to go up against much more dangerous creatures. I will have to stick with what I can comfortably deal with even if I have no ether or extra genes. Sylas laid down his pride and realized he couldn't be some big game hunter if he wanted to survive. If he could just eat bugs on his way to gaining genes, he would do so. But he had killed a few while stalking the elk just for a meal, and there was never anything to gain. He assumed that the system had some sort of minimum size requirement, or he was targeting the wrong kind of bugs. There is some good news aside from the blow to his ego. For one, the corpses of the 2 red foxes he had killed were much more manageable than the elk. If he used his blade aura to target a small part of it, he could even cook them without starting a fire. Grandfather said I should look for a dungeon soon as well. Reach 20 physical as quickly as possible and enter a dungeon. There were only 2 ways to gain items and treasures aside from genes in this gamified world. The first was to steal from spawn cities, and the second was dungeons. These spawn cities were different from the system cities that would appear after the trial period was over. They were challenges created for those that chose the common city steal. Though there was no rule that said that Sylas couldn't attack one even without a city steal, it's just that he would have a death wish if he tried to do so. The second and more manageable challenge were the dungeons. That wasn't to say that they were easy, but rather that the variables were tightly controlled. Unfortunately, entering a dungeon was easier said than done. According to his grandfather, dungeons gave off a dense concentration of ether. Due to that, more powerful creatures tended to flock around it, even though they could not enter. 20 physical was more of a requirement just to lay eyes on it than it was a minimum to enter. Sylas took a breath. Sleep. He broke out into a light jog, taking a more roundabout route back to the elk's territory. He found a natural gourd hanging from a tree and ripped it off. Then, he entered the region of a familiar lake. Gourds needed to be carefully dried and prepped for a long while before they could be used like containers. But Sylas had a convenient shortcut for that. At this point, blade aura felt far more useful for miscellaneous matters than it was for actual combat. This would be the only convenient time he would be able to come to this lake, so he had to take advantage. Sylas froze. He looked down at the clear waters and couldn't believe what he was seeing. Aside from the dirty reflection that looked back at him, beyond that, deep within, there seemed to be something radiating a dense pulse of ether. It was a dungeon, Sylas was certain. But what he couldn't understand was how he could possibly be so unlucky. If the dungeon was in the water, wouldn't that mean that all the most powerful beasts would flock here after their evolutions were complete? Even if he followed down the river, because of what he had learned from his grandfather, he knew it would be useless. With this level of ether being pumped out, it would definitely follow the current and raise the concentration for countless kilometers. The longer this dungeon went unfinished, the worse the situation would get. How would he get water? Fruits? Rain? Blood? These were the only answers Sylas could come up with, but each was unreliable. Fruits or vegetables could tide his hydration over for a while, but how long? An extra few days? Given how much exercise he was doing on a daily basis, his throat was already dry after just a day alone, and he was running on empty. If not for his great stamina, he might have already collapsed. Rain? This was a rainforest, after all. In a particularly tropical rainforest, it might even occur every few hours. However, in this last day, no rain had fallen. In addition, he had no idea how the introduction of ether would impact the ecosystem and weather. Even if it had rained, it would be hard to rely on it. If he took a step back and chose to blindly believe that it would rain, how would he capture it? His mobility was his greatest asset right now, but having a reliable form of collecting rain required a base, a protected one. And what if one day his base was compromised and all his accumulated rain was ruined? Relying on blood was the worst of the options. He still hadn't dismissed the possibility that the red fox gave him rabies. How could he, in good conscience, drink blood? Even if he was willing to take that chance, blood had a sodium content about as high as salt water. He would just be killing himself slowly. Sylas dunked his head into the water. Having already been chilled by the night, it was a nice shock to his system. He greedily took large gulps, and for the first time, he wasn't hyper-fixated on the surrounding environment, always looking around another corner for the next creature that wanted to eat his flesh. It was easily a minute before he pulled himself out. This was what he had wanted, no? Excitement? Was this exciting? No, it was terrifying. There was a slight tremor in his body that hadn't been there before. The idea of slowly dying of dehydration played in his mind so vividly that he might as well have already experienced it once before. That was the ultimate outcome. No matter how many ideas he thought of, that was the end of it. He couldn't escape it. If he left here today, it would be a race between his body tapping out and his physical reaching 20, but even if the latter managed to win out, what state would his body be in at that point? Could he even fight his way back here? He had followed that elk for so long, moving across dozens of kilometers, and yet didn't see a single ounce of water elsewhere. He didn't like that feeling of helplessness. It was why he had made the stupid decision of coming here in the first place. Sylas stood at his feet. He pulled his blood-matted shirt and pants off before he began to clean his body. All the dirt, mud, and grime from the day were peeled off layer by layer under the harsh rubbing of his fingers. His green eyes didn't contain any fear nor helplessness. It was hard to read his emotions at all as he finally stepped out, feeling the cool wind slowly dry him. He stood there in silence, ironically as one with nature as he had ever been. Somewhere deep inside, he seemed to understand that this might truly be his last day. His gaze landed on a tree with particularly large leaves, and he pulled down a few vines from the surroundings. Carefully, he bundled his clothing into these leaves and tied them up tight using the vines. Then, he dove into the waters, holding his short spear and antler blade in one hand, while dragging his bundle of clothes in the other. He would rather die in that dungeon than slowly cannibalize his own body out here. That was the choice of Sylas Brown. Sylas' feet kicked at the water. In the depths of the darkness, the only thing that provided a light was the dungeon pumping with ether in the distance. It must have been at least 20 meters beneath the surface, but had it been the light of day, Sylas wouldn't have noticed it at all. Though Sylas thought about the possibility that this dungeon would take place entirely in the water, according to his grandfather, there would be a small introduction to the dungeon before you entered. It could only be said that if the dungeon was truly underwater, he would be doubly screwed. At that point, he could only try to store as much water as he could in the gourds and hope it rained more often. It didn't take him more than a few seconds to reach the cave opening. Dexterity seems to be more important in the water than speed. Sylas gave some breath to a fleeting thought before a flash appeared in his mind. Slithering Madness, F. Level maximum, 0. Recommended, 50 physical. Description: lurking in the depths, high in the trees and on the forest floors. They are natural predators, unfettered and unbothered. So scorned by the skies, they've been restricted to a life of crawling on their bellies. But their day to rise again is not far off. Sylas would have sucked in a cold breath if he wasn't submerged in water right now. According to his grandfather, 20 physical was recommended, but Sylas knew his grandfather well. Ever since Sylas was young, his grandfather had been trying to manipulate him using information, not out of maliciousness, but rather kind intentions. Sylas seemed to very easily see both sides of a situation and could rationally pick a middle ground that fit well with what was in line with reality. This was a trait not taught to him by his parents, but rather his grandfather. Ever since he was about 16, he could see through his grandfather's intentions and somewhat knew that Magnus was trying to pull him toward a certain direction. But despite his demeanor, Sylas loved his family and felt no need to expose his grandfather for something so trivial. Magnus had learned very early on that Sylas couldn't be pushed and pulled with appeals to emotion and fallacies. The facts were what one had to manipulate or obstruct to get at him. This was all to say that when his grandfather said he would need 20 physical, it was almost certainly less than that. Sylas had guessed that most dungeons probably had a recommended entry of around 15 physical, maybe even less. But 50? Why would this dungeon's recommended stats be so high? That was more than double that of the most dangerous creature he had seen until now, the Titanoboa. That aside, what about the explanation? How could it be considered a description at all? It only barely confirmed to him by the comments about trees and the ground that it at least wouldn't be underwater. And yet there was no other choice. Will you enter? Yes, no. The words practically taunted him, but he never hesitated when he made decisions. The world blurred around him. Sylas' eyes focused, and what appeared before him was an odd world. The first thing he felt was the cobbled stone beneath his feet. As he continued to look around, he pulled out his bundle of clothing and slipped on the mud in blood-caked cheap pair of pants and shirt the system had given him. The world was dark in an odd sense because the skies were pitch black without stars or a moon in sight, and yet he could see just fine, almost as though the ground and the objects on it gave off their own weird light. It was hard to see anything that deviated away from the cobblestone path, though, so his eyes could only focus on the forked road ahead. Down one path, the cobbled road curved and seemed to lead toward more stone. Down the other, foliage began to appear, grass grew from the cracks of the stone, and the faint outline of trees could be seen in the distance. A choice. Sylas didn't rush. He had expected to be thrown into danger immediately, or even die a sudden death before he could get a lay of the land. But this was unexpectedly peaceful. If he didn't take the opportunity to take a breath now, he might never get another chance. The description should clearly be about snakes, but in that case, why would there be a path that seemed to lead toward a civilization of some sort? Unless the snakes the description referred to are one of those alien races grandfather mentioned. In the end, Sylas walked toward the path of dense foliage. Ultimately, only one thing mattered to him, and that was maximizing his chances at survival. Civilization sounded nice and cozy, but it would also plummet his odds of living to zero. There would be no terrain to take advantage of, no place to hide, and everything would be up to his raw ability. On the side of the wilderness, he at least had a small chance. The only silver lining in all of this was the fact that the animal he was the most confident in dealing with was the snake. Not that it would matter if they all had 50 physical. However, Sylas had his own opinions on that. The recommended physical should be proportional to the best challenge this dungeon had to offer. In that case, it should mean that the boss of this dungeon would take 50 physical for one to have a shot at defeating it, but that didn't necessarily mean all the challenges would be at that level. If he could pick and choose his targets like he had with the red fox, he had a chance. The last red fox he had dealt with already had 18 physical. There was a ray of hope, even though it was small. The cobbled stone path slowly disappeared, and Sylas watched as the skies above his head began to gain color as the previous path vanished. Did I make the right choice? Sylas never hesitated when he made a decision, but that didn't mean he wouldn't reflect. The fact he felt like he had entered a new world now meant that he had given something up, but he wasn't even sure what the other choice was about. That feeling of not knowing grated on him, but he didn't have the time to linger on it. His steps slowed, and he began to scan each and every leaf he came across as though it might be the next one to suddenly pop out with a vicious snake. Dungeons came in all shapes and sizes. His grandfather had said they likely hadn't documented them all, and unfortunately, this seemed to be among the undocumented ones. As Sylas continued to walk, his sense of focus riding an edge of adrenaline, his anticipation only grew with every second an enemy didn't appear. While the cobbled stone path had vanished, the forest itself had still carved out a small, unkept path. It was hard to spot amidst all the foliage, and Sylas guessed that if he had been in the forest itself, he could have easily missed it. But because he had started off on the path, it was easy to continue following it. Should I? After moving about 50 meters or so, Sylas made the decision to deviate from the path. Not far, but rather 3 to 5 meters offset to the right. He wanted to see where the path was leading to, but he didn't want to dive headfirst into what was coming either. Every decision he made felt like he had done so blindly. There just didn't seem to be anything better to do. He might very well be trading in one danger for another. The path might be leading him to danger, but who knew if there were venomous snakes ready to bite at his ankles in all this high grass? If he had the skill to, he would have used the trees as a path instead, but other than some light experience with recreational rock climbing, he wasn't exactly a spry monkey. He continued to follow the path, and eventually he reached it. There's just no way. Little Madness F. Level 0. Physical 31. Mental 3. Will 6. Up ahead, there was a small clearing, the only obvious path leading to it that didn't require leaping over shrubbery or trees, being the very path Sylas was offset from. In that clearing, a python with scales of orange and black lay in the grass. Though it was curled up, it must have been at least 5 meters long, while its jaw was lined with countless little spikes. 31 physical is one thing, but 3 mental. Assuming its wisdom was 0 and its charisma was likewise low, that would mean that its intelligence is double mine. Wisdom was a measure of one's reasoning ability, knowledge, and other matters related of the sort. These creatures were likely not intelligent in that way, just yet. However, intelligence was a measure of ether control and abundance. If Sylas' assumption was correct, he was outclassed by an impossibly large margin. It was possible that the recommendation of 50 physical was just to offset the disparity in ether control. These creatures were naturally granted such abilities in their sleep, but Sylas and others like him could only slowly unlock them over time through genes and other methods. Was he just supposed to rush in and throw his life away? Sylas frowned. There had to be another method. He turned back and began to slowly comb through the forest, keeping track of where he was, where he had been, and where he was going. He must have spent half an hour going around, and yet he found nothing. One would have thought that some other creature would have at least jumped out at him, but it seemed that there were no others present. Is this a floor dungeon? A dungeon separated into several floors usually had this sort of setup. The next floor wouldn't appear until the boss of this one was defeated. But according to his grandfather, such dungeons usually had smaller opponents lingering around. This slithering madness dungeon, though, had none of that. Sylas wasn't sure whether to be relieved or devastated. Without smaller enemies to face, he had no way of increasing his strength. Sylas winced as his toes hit against something. Luckily, he had been walking quite slowly and observing every little thing around him, or he would have face planted right into the barrier. He had walked so far that he returned to his original starting area, the very area where the cobblestone path had originally been and disappeared. About what I expected. If the choice was an important aspect of the dungeon, it wouldn't just let him reverse it without reason. What's that? Sylas touched the barrier again, this time more than ready to process the ripples. All across it, appearing and disappearing in a flash, snakes of all shapes and sizes performed all kinds of movements. Some seemed to be in battle, some seemed to be intertwined in an odd mating ritual, and some simply rose high, baring their fangs and roaring at Sylas. It only appeared for a moment, but Sylas felt his heart skip a beat. He kept touching the barrier again and again, just to see those ripples once more. His eyes went red, but he didn't have a reflection of himself to see it. It was instead the rushing of his blood and the pain in his eyes that made him pull back, his features pulling into a tight frown. Uriel has been influenced. -1 will temporary. Sylas was surprised by the sudden notification. Just looking at the barrier had done that to him? And what did temporary mean? Would it be a few seconds? Hours? Days? What was his strongest stat aside from dexterity, but he couldn't say that he cared very much that he lost a point. When he had gained one, he didn't feel much different to begin with. And like he had said previously, he felt the fact there was a will stat was peculiar. How could you even measure that? Although Sylas was a bit stubborn about it, he wasn't a fool, either. He chose to pull back from the barrier for now and take note of how long it would take to recover. Since the system listed will, and just now he had entered a bit of trance, it was obviously more important than he had given it credit for. He was in a new world now, and he had to do away with his old way of thinking about some things. Sylas continued to walk around, getting a lay of the land. Why add all this extra space if the boss fight is the only thing of importance here? He came across a small lake. It didn't seem to have anything feeding into it, but it did give him a sense of calm. Taking a seat by its shores, he just sat there and stared out into it. There's nothing stopping me from staying here forever unless there's some hidden timer I'm not aware of. I'm not sure if it's possible to alert that python, but at this point, it would be better to fight it in all this than in that opening. At least I'd have a chance to run out here. Thinking to this point, Sylas began to build a fire. Once it was complete, he took out one of the 2 red fox carcasses, using the antler blade and the small lake to clean it up. He didn't have any seasonings to pair it with, but it was still the best meal he had ever had. He ate the entire fox, leaving nothing wasted but its inner organs and bones. It's gone now. Will, 11. His will had gone back to 11, but it didn't take the entirety of the hour or so he had just wasted. It took just under 20 minutes or so. It was just a rough guess he had. It wasn't as though he had a clock. He just felt he was quite good at roughly estimating that sort of thing. Though who knew, his sense of time might have already been distorted. I feel energetic. Sylas hadn't slept in over a day now, so he had already begun to feel some lingering fatigue. But after eating the red fox, it felt like he had just gotten a full night's rest. He had wanted to take the opportunity to get some sleep in as well, but it seemed that was no longer necessary. Sylas took note of where the lake was after taking another long drink, then began to walk around once again. He didn't even know what he was looking for. Maybe it wasn't a thing he wanted, but a flash of inspiration instead. Uriel has been influenced. -1 will temporary. He ended up running into another barrier, part of the same larger hole, but located in a different region. He had just told himself to not be so stubborn, but something about the fact something could impact his own willpower was annoying him. Or maybe it was just that this situation was really starting to get to him. It's just taking away and giving me back the same point it gave me in the first place. The only reason his will was 11 was because of his A Patient Stalker title. He found it somewhat amusing that it was this point that was being taken and given once more again and again. It felt like a farce. It even made him a bit angry. He was Sylas Brown. He walked to the rhythm of his own beat. Sylas shook his head. This wasn't like him. He frowned. Uriel has been tainted. -2 will temporary. The moment the debuff hit him, Sylas felt a wave of nausea. It came so suddenly and unexpectedly that he heaved. A burning in his throat overwhelmed his senses, and he felt that he was just moments away from throwing up the meal he just had. No, I can't. This thought consumed him. He only had 1 fox carcass remaining. The only other food in the vicinity seemed to be that boss python. If he threw up here, the loss would be tremendous. Pull yourself together. Sylas couldn't remember being so agitated in a long time. Ever since he had left his formative years, he was used to being calm and in control. Maybe his greatest fear was losing that control. He maintained strict discipline. He didn't drink, he didn't do drugs, he didn't even eat sugar because he didn't like the influence it had on him. But now some mysterious force was pulling at him from all sides, playing with his mind, and he absolutely hated it. Enough! Sylas' red eyes returned, but this time it wasn't due to him staring at the barrier. It was rather something inside of them that spun wildly out of control. This something wasn't natural. It was a product of the debuff that was pressing down on him. It retaliated against Sylas' will, pressing it down even further. Your will has been tainted. -1 will, temporary. Your will has been tainted. -1 will, temporary. The first time it appeared, it had said influenced. The debuff of -2 will, though, had come with a tainted tag. Every time Sylas tried to fight back against it, it would lash out again, ripping out another piece of his will. Sylas knew that, logically, he should stop. He should stop moving, remove as much sensory information as he could, and hunker down. This was the smart thing to do, the logical thing to do. The moment his will fell beneath 10, the barrier seemed to have placed a suppressive effect on him, an effect he hadn't noticed earlier because his will was too high. Sylas hadn't even realized that the moment he chose a path, the challenge had begun. The reason there was no timer was because no one could stay here indefinitely, not without losing their mind and going to challenge the python in a fit of rage. But Sylas had accidentally stumbled onto this hidden challenge all on his own. Sylas' will was blinking and flashing, and suddenly it hit a critical low. Will 1. Sylas' expression turned savage and wild. He bared his teeth as though he were a wild beast, veins pumping across his body as though individual pythons were squirming beneath his skin. He looked in the direction of the boss monster. It was as though he could sense it all so clearly, but when he exploded forward, his body was jerked backward. A light of madness glowed in his eyes as he looked at his arm. His fingers dug into the bark of a tree just adjacent to him. He held on to it with everything he had, blood pooling from his nails, and particularly nasty streaks of veins pumping along his forearm. His body wanted to go in one direction, but this arm alone seemed to have a mind of its own. He pulled hard, and a few of his nails chipped as he ripped himself free. He rushed forward with his greatest speed, only for his arm to latch onto another tree. This time, he fell back hard, a stinging pain coming from his shoulder. From an outside observer, it looked as though he had just tried to tackle a tree. The fact he got away with only a stinging pain was a miracle to begin with. I said enough. The roar came out of just one side of Sylas' mouth, one half of his lips quirking in an attempt to speak, and the other wanting to continue growling and baring his fangs. He felt as though he was trapped inside of his own mind, just the smallest hint of sanity keeping him together. If he allowed himself to run to that python, the only path for him remaining would be death. This wasn't the ending he wanted. He was in control of nothing if not his own mind, his own thoughts. There was true fury stirring within him, but it was only making the situation worse. The debuff, the curse, or whatever this influence was, latched onto it and stirred it up, pulling out parts hidden so deep that even Sylas didn't know they existed. And yet, he was forced to face them. Why had he come here? Why did he put his life at risk? Why did he look his loving mother and father in the eye, his adorable little sister, and lie to them? It wasn't just for some excitement. That was too small a part of it. It wasn't because he was dissatisfied with his life. That was too small a part of it. It wasn't even because he cherished his own last name so much and refused to be a Grimblade. And that was despite the fact he still called himself Sylas Brown to this day, regardless of what this damn system said. It was because he couldn't stand the idea of being under someone else's heel. It was because he didn't want to be just a cog in the wheel. He wanted to be the wheel itself, the carriage that rolled on it, the treasure that was being escorted from place to place in luxury. He had childishly come to throw his life away in a world he knew next to nothing about, all because he couldn't keep his ego in check. That was the part he had been ignoring. That was the part of him that he had buried deep, the part he had ignored because he considered himself a logical man above such boorish and man-child-like ideals. But he wasn't. He was still a hot-blooded young man in his 20s. He wasn't free of those dreams all young men had. To be a hero, a knight in shining armor, Rambo in a forest with a machine gun tucked under one arm and a machete in the other. Title unlocked. A flexible will. Your will is truly one of a kind, but it is immature and still changing. Continue to forge it, young man. Plus 10 will. Plus 10% will. Sylas hardly registered the notification. The red slowly receded from his eyes, and he coughed heavily, waves of pain hitting his body, especially from his right hand. Looking at it shakily, he had completely lost one nail, and two others were split right in the middle. It might have been even better if he lost them completely. At the very least, this seemed to be his worst injury. The rest was just aches and bruises. You have survived the madness. Your comprehension of the madness has deepened. Plus 1 will. Finally, Sylas got a grasp of what was going on. He slowly rose to his feet, his eyes widening when he saw that he was actually standing at the very edge of a familiar clearing. Just another half-meter, and he would have been in the boss territory. The thought was frightening, but for some reason, he calmed down much quicker than he felt he should have. He looked at his stat menu. Name, Sylas Grimblade. Species, Human F. Affiliation, Grimblade Lineage. Level, 0. Titles, A Flexible Will, A Patient Stalker. Physical, 8. Strength, 5. Constitution, 5. Dexterity, 13. Speed, 8. Mental, 6. Intelligence, 5. Wisdom, 10. Charisma, 2. Will, 24. Luck, 1. Skill, Comprehensions, Madness. Gene state, soft. Fragmented genes, Grimblade Lineage, F. 2 Dexterity, F. Gene talents, Blade Aura, Mutated Weakened, Sudden Burst, Dormant, F. That's a slightly different color. It was very subtle, and only by a shade or two, but Sylas felt that a flexible will had a deeper color than a patient stalker. His grandfather had said that titles with percentage boosts were rarer, so maybe that was part of it. But he once again found it peculiar that he didn't have grades associated with titles. Was the slight color change supposed to be the replacement? He wasn't sure. Sylas' attention was drawn to the comprehension portion. He hadn't seen anything but a dashed line there before, but now there was madness. In addition, it had a familiar line through the grade tag, much like his blade or a gene talent did. Sylas took that to mean that his comprehension was too lacking for it to be properly ranked. What was more surprising than that was that he had actually come across a comprehension at all. According to his grandfather, comprehensions were about the only thing that could compete with gene talents in terms of usefulness. Skills could fall into that category as well, but there were a wide range of skills, many of which could be entirely useless. Gene talents and comprehensions, however, almost never were. This was his grandfather's understanding, anyway. Sylas frowned. Madness, do I need to lose my mind to use it? I don't like that. Though Sylas thought about this, he didn't dismiss it outright for two reasons. First, he didn't unlock this comprehension until he broke free from the madness. So, there was a chance that losing his mind wasn't a requirement, and it was actually the exact opposite. Second, what choice did he have? He had finally found a reasonable method of making it out of here. If he could use the barrier to enter the state of madness, and then break free continuously, wouldn't he unlock his comprehension fully? Maybe this madness comprehension could help him to beat the python. With this thought, Sylas didn't waste time. The situation was a bit helpless. He had only gotten 2 genes out of his soft gene state, and time was ticking away. Now that he had some hope again, he couldn't waste any more time than he needed to. You have survived the madness. Your comprehension of the madness has deepened. Plus 1 will. You have survived the madness. Your comprehension of the madness has deepened. Plus 1 will. You have survived the madness. Your comprehension of the madness has deepened. Plus 1 will. You have survived the madness. Your comprehension of the madness has deepened. Plus 1 will. It was easier than Sylas could have ever imagined. The first time, he almost threw himself toward his death. But now he didn't even suffer a debuff, and he broke free after just a few seconds. The worst he experienced was the tensing of his body, that feeling of his blood rushing through him, and then it all went away. He began to truly study the images. They flashed for just a short time, but for some reason, they began to linger in his mind for longer and longer. It wasn't just a wild array of snakes any longer, but it became a dance of sorts, a ritual painted in its own sort of beauty, one an animal bound to the earth, hoping to one day soar once again, of a creature marred by its own madness. You have survived the madness. Your comprehension of the madness has deepened. You have comprehended the madness. +3 will. +10 charisma. Sylas looked at his stat screen. Name, Sylas Grimblade. Species, human F. Affiliation, Grimblade lineage. Level, 0. Titles, a flexible will, a patient stalker. Physical, 8. Strength, 5. Constitution, 5. Dexterity, 13. Speed, 8. Mental, 9. Intelligence, 5. Wisdom, 10. Charisma, 12. Will, 36. Luck, 1. Skill, comprehensions, madness, F. Gene state, soft. Fragmented genes, Grimblade lineage, F. 2. Dexterity, F. Gene talents, blade aura, mutated weakened. Sudden burst, dormant, F. With his intention, Sylas focused deeper on madness. Madness, F. The madness consumes you, but does not control you. Instead, it becomes your tool to both control yourself and others. You, while steeped in madness, maintain your wits about you. Your enemies, though, are not so lucky. +100% charisma. +100% will. Charisma, it seems that this isn't just a boost to myself, but it forms an intention that attacks my enemies. Charisma was a stat that decided how much of your own will you could impose on an opponent. Sylas still wasn't sure exactly what this meant, but in this context, it should mean that he could force his enemies to face the same madness as himself. But is this helpful? When Sylas was steeped in the madness, he just wanted to fight for longer and harder. Sure, he almost threw himself to his death, but if his enemies were much stronger than him, it would just make him die faster. Sylas didn't let the angst get to him so quickly this time, and he chose to test it out first. With some intention of his will, he activated madness by stirring his comprehension. He felt an odd force field take shape around him, one that he had already begun to vaguely feel after his charisma reached 12. Now, however, it was more obvious, and the world even turned a slight shade of red. Veins bulged across Sylas' body, but as expected, he was able to remain calm. It doesn't really feel different. It's a lot like my dexterity. It feels like I can pull out the peak of my strength, but it doesn't necessarily add to my strength. It only increases my control of it. Sylas put this feeling to the test by running around a bit. My pain feels duller. It's easier to ignore. My body control is a lot greater. Though my dexterity stat hasn't changed at all, it feels like it's at least doubled. The same can be said for my stamina, even though it's not a shown stat. My body control is on a level where I'm at peak efficiency all the time. I wonder if Sylas activated Blade Aura. He just wanted to see if the added stamina might impact it too. His brows shot up. The formerly silvery light had a tinge of red to it now. It was steadier and definitely far stronger. The time ticked by, and as expected, even after a minute, it didn't show signs of fading. Even after 2, it was still fine. It was only after 3 that Sylas began to feel some fatigue, but it wasn't coming from his blade aura at all, but rather the usage of madness. He exhaled a breath and let the feeling dissipate. The same wave of fatigue he usually got after using up blade aura didn't come. This feeling was much more stable and relaxing, as though he had just spent a little bit too long reading. He knew he could have pushed himself much further, but likewise he would have risked falling into the madness well and truly. Sylas went back to the barrier to see if he could use it to continue increasing his will. He had a feeling that the higher his will stat, the longer he'd be able to use madness for. Unfortunately, The barrier couldn't even affect him anymore. He had already expected this, but he had to cover all his bases. The only thing left to do is to hope that this is enough. Then, he was about to turn his attention to the python again. According to his plan, he would test the ends of the madness, and when there was nothing else to learn, he would go and fight. But then something about these images caught his attention again. They were even clearer now than they were before. There were 3 distinct sections: the battle section, the mating section, and the bearing fangs section. Each one exuded its own peculiarity. In the past, they had blurred into a single bundle of madness. But now that Sylas had actually comprehended madness, he could feel the subtleties. Sylas became a bit lost. It was odd. He could innately tell what the snakes were doing, but he didn't have an easy method of translating it to his own body. There was a barrier that lay between him and them. It was one part frustrating, but another part curious. He was ultimately a scholar. He had spent more time than he knew with his head buried deep in his research or a paper of some sort. His discipline was often what carried him through those moments, but often it was fascination as well. His doctoral thesis had been about moving the world of anti-venom toward the world of vaccines, namely mRNA vaccines. It was quite useless, honestly. A large part of why venom used anti-venom as a counter, a more short-term solution, was because venomous creatures were rare and only a small segment of the population met them. No one would feel the need to immunize a large population of people against a snake they only had a 1 in a billion chance of coming across. Even so, he had been fascinated by the topic because of the mongoose. It was a small, almost adorable creature, and yet it was well known as the bane of venomous snakes due to its natural defenses against venom. He had found it funny that a cute little creature could do what humans couldn't, so he had chosen this route for his doctorate. It was just pure curiosity. Something about this felt so similar. Sylas suddenly shook his head, feeling that he was getting sucked in deep. When he did, he found that his body had recovered from the madness already. Has it been that long? Or was it something else? He wasn't sure until he saw something new. Skill, Madden Meditation F. Sylas had been so engrossed that he hadn't noticed this change at all. He hadn't known that it was possible to miss notifications. Madden Meditation F. You are deeply in tune with the madness of your ancestors. It helps you to focus and relax. Understanding yourself is a form of peace, and with peace comes healing. It was only after reading the description that Sylas realized the oddity. All the time he had spent observing the mural of snakes, he had been thinking about himself. He hadn't even thought about his doctorate in years. Why had it even come to mind? It wasn't like Sylas was passionate about snakes. He just found them somewhat interesting. And he was feeling that now he might be a little bit of an adrenaline junkie on one hand and a control freak on another. What was a better rush of adrenaline than handling creatures that could kill you with a single nick? And what was a better form of control than facing them without a hint of fear? I'm insane. Sylas was speechless toward his own thoughts. He felt that he had great self-discipline, and he even had daily meditation rituals. Simply put, he spent a lot of time in his own mind, but he had never assessed himself in this way. Was it because of the madness? Was it influencing him more than he thought? Or was this truly him? Sylas pulled away from the barrier and looked at his notification. The moment he wondered if there was a way to check what he had missed, a new menu appeared. This menu seemed to list all of his previous notifications in chronological order, starting with the most recent. Everything looked normal, and the only thing he had missed was the new skill. He wasn't sure how powerful or weak this skill was, though. He found himself once again feeling that there was too great a lack of information coming from the system. The system is already enough of a help. I'm not sure what I'd do if it didn't exist. Sylas concluded his thoughts with that and turned his focus toward understanding everything about madness now. With Madden Meditation as a support skill, it went along much faster. Upon activation, the most obvious change was his stat boost to charisma and will. However, Sylas felt that this was only a surface-level change. The elevation of charisma and will likewise seem to bolster his other stats. Although it wasn't reflective in the numbers, it just felt like his body was running like a well-oiled machine, almost like his stats just meant more per point. This was most obviously reflected in Blade Aura, which could now be used for just over 3 minutes. What was more interesting than that was that Blade Aura also seemed to be applicable to his body now. Well, it was before as well. But this time, it didn't make him feel like he was boiling from the inside out. When it was applied solely to his body, it could last for about 5 minutes, which was the whole length he could have Madness activated for as well. However, while Blade Aura could last longer applied directly to his fists, it was also weaker. The quality-based amplification was still there and obvious. Clearly, Blade Aura believed his femur short spear was the better weapon. Madden Meditation made the various experiments far easier on Sylas. It only took about 5 minutes to recover completely from 5 minutes of usage, so it was a nice trade-off. Without Madden Meditation, it took upwards of half an hour. It was just unfortunate that he couldn't use Madden Meditation on the move. He had to be completely still, and except in this environment where the only threat was locked away in a far-off region, he would be hard-pressed to find a place where it would be easy to use it. Sylas took a breath. It seemed that really was all there was this time. It was time to see what this little madness creature was all about. Sylas looked at the creature again. Seeing that its will was so low, he had some questions himself about how this would go. Madness was obviously part of what this dungeon wanted him to comprehend, but he had also done it in a very unconventional way, or so he assumed. But if this python could use madness as well, wouldn't it lose its mind almost instantly? Even with 36 will, Sylas could only use madness for 5 minutes. How would this creature fare? Sylas picked up a rock and tried to throw it right at the python's head. But before it made it far, it bounced off a barrier. Seems it won't let me play any tricks. This probably means if I take a step in there, I won't be able to exit. The python didn't even react to the change, but Sylas took note that the barrier here was identical to the large one that surrounded the entire forest. He rushed in. Much like always when he made a decision, he never hesitated. The python stirred awake, its scales rippling as its orange-black slit eyes landed right on Sylas. It opened its jaw, and a scream came from it. It was a cross between a steam engine's whistle and a hacking cough. It was the kind of thing one would never expect to come from a snake at all. And then it pounced. Sylas activated madness. The one thing he hadn't been able to test was how his comprehension could influence other creatures, because there weren't any creatures around to influence. However, there was one thing he had noticed previously. When he pushed his will outward, using his charisma as a conduit to impose his thoughts onto the world, it went beyond just an ethereal result. Back then, he had been able to push the shoreline of the lake away from him. It was just a few centimeters and hardly noticeable. But when his intention was poured onto the snake, its acceleration plummeted and its eyes turned red. It seemed to lose focus on Sylas, and its body thrashed about wildly. As expected, the strength and constitution of the snake were off the charts, but its speed and dexterity were lacking. Sylas ducked beneath a swing of its tail and slashed his blade or infused antler blade at its scales. The femur short spear was his best weapon, but he didn't want to use it just yet, not until he understood just how hard the defenses of this python were. Soon, he realized he was right to be cautious. His attack did nothing but slightly push the head of the python toward the ground. His blade rebounded off of its scales as though he was a toddler trying to wrestle with his parent. Sylas ducked and rolled, leaping back to his feet on the other side of the thrashing python. It was beginning to move more and more wildly, attacking every and anything indiscriminately. The reaction was fiercer than what Sylas had expected, but it also didn't put the python out of commission. Considering the disparity in will and likely charisma, Sylas would have hoped to do more than just make this powerful creature rampage about like this, but he considered himself lucky to even be in this position to begin with. Maybe I can tire it out, Sylas thought. He didn't want to gamble on it. He could only last for 5 minutes, and the constitution of this snake was so high. Who was to say they would run out of energy to give before him? Attacking its eyes is the best chance. I can only hope that ether doesn't help these creatures to be invulnerable to even such a sensitive location. Sylas' gaze sharpened as he circled around Little Madness. He didn't dare to release madness for fear that the snake would regain control of itself soon after. He had no choice but to end this within 5 minutes. He suddenly accelerated forward. Sylas only had 5 strength. It wasn't a surprise to him that his attack wasn't strong enough to injure a beast like this. He would have to lean on his strengths. With the python thrashing about so wildly, most wouldn't be able to do anything about it. How could you target such a small target when the rest of it was moving so erratically? But the moment Little Madness entered a relatively central part of the clearing, Sylas burst into action again. He raised his bone-short spear up in an overhand grip. Veins pulsed across his body, his green eyes gaining just the slightest sheen of red to them. There, he struck down, piercing right into the python's eye. However, he miscalculated. It wasn't his strike itself. What he didn't realize in this state of absolute madness was that Little Madness couldn't even feel pain. It didn't change its actions in the slightest, still madly lashing out at everything there was. It was a common misconception that animals didn't feel pain the way humans did. It was evolutionarily beneficial to them to hide their pain so that they could survive in the wild, but they felt pain much the same way humans did, if not more so. In fact, many of the most predatory beasts in existence were maybe even more cowardly than humans as well. Unfortunately, in a state of madness, the python didn't care for any of that. Sylas dodged backward, forced to let go of his bone spear. The python continued to madly thrash about, so much so that it head-butted the barrier, shattering Sylas' femur-short spear and driving it further into its skull. Finally, Little Madness shuddered. Even in its last moment, it probably didn't notice that it had done this to itself. But Sylas couldn't even feel happy. His jaw clenched. He had lost his best weapon, just like that. He truly regretted not going back to get the second short spear he had created, but he didn't think he had the time to do so. With the night already waning, if he tried to do a round trip, he might get caught up in battles as the creatures began to wake up. What he had feared the most weren't the land animals, though, but rather the creatures he had spotted sleeping in the lake. He was already hardly a match on land. If he had a fight in the water, he would be finished. Sylas took a breath and exhaled. Nothing had gone right this whole time, but hadn't he made it here? You have slain Little Madness. Floor 1 of Slithering Madness cleared. Rewards: Little Madness skill. Inflexible Gene elixir consumable. Little Madness Slayer title. Sylas frowned, pushing forward with his intention. He clicked each one for more information. Little Madness skill. A little bit of madness never hurt anyone. Exchange your sanity for a power boost. Wasn't this just a far weaker version of his madness comprehension? Plus, this seemed to come with side effects his madness comprehension didn't have at all. Inflexible Gene Stat Elixir consumable. A medicine for the soul and not for the taste. Drink this and maintain an inflexible gene state for 3 days. This wasn't entirely useless. Although he had a soft gene state right now, which was 2 levels above this, it wouldn't last forever. Still, it was a bit shabby. His soft gene state gave him a 50% success rate of claiming new genes, but this would only give him a 10% chance of success. It was unfortunate. Little Madness Slayer title. You have taken down an apprentice of the madness. Keep going, and one day, you just might step onto the path of true madness. +1 will. +1 charisma. Sylas shook his head, especially when he saw what happened to his stat menu afterward. Name: Sylas Grimblade. Species: Human F. Affiliation: Grimblade Lineage. Level: 0. Titles: A Flexible Will, A Patient Stalker, Little Madness Slayer Dormant. Physical: 8. Strength: 5. Constitution: 5. Dexterity: 13. Speed: 8. Mental: 9. Intelligence: 5. Wisdom: 10. Charisma: 12. Will: 36. Luck: 1. Skill: Madden Meditation F. Little Madness F. Comprehensions: Madness F. Gene State: Soft. Fragmented Genes: Grimblade Lineage F. To Dexterity F. Gene Talents: Blade Aura, Mutated Weakened, Sudden Burst Dormant F. For some reason, the Little Madness Slayer title was dormant, and he didn't even get the stat boost from them. He didn't really need more will or charisma, but it wouldn't exactly hurt either. In summary, though, he had gotten very little out of this victory aside from the right to go and risk his life again on the second floor. He had a skill that was useless, a title that was dormant, and an elixir he would probably only drink if he really had no other options. Even then, he had to figure out a convenient way to carry this elixir around with him, because he didn't have a bag. I could try to make one out of the fox skins. Sylas decided he would do this before looking toward his final hope, Little Madness corpse. He walked over and put a hand on its head. Little Madness. Genes detected. Fragmented gene. 7. Constitution F. Attempt assimilation? Yes, no. Sylas' brows raised. His grandfather hadn't told him this was possible, but this made sense. Maybe it was a case of, if a creature assimilated enough fragmented genes, they would form a common gene, so on and so forth. This would make his 50% chance worth far more, assuming that it did so one by one and wasn't an all-or-nothing sort of situation. Gene assimilation starting. Gene assimilation triggered. Gene assimilation successful. Gene assimilation successful. Gene assimilation failed. Gene assimilation successful. Gene assimilation failed. Gene assimilation failed. Gene assimilation successful. Constitution 9. Sylas exhaled a breath when he saw this. 4-7 was a good outcome. He was happy that it wasn't an all-or-nothing situation. Although it would have been amazing to get all 7, just in a risk assessment sort of situation like this one, this was for the best. Floor 2. He quietly thought to himself. He put a hand on Little Madness, hoping it would allow him to take it. He had no method of cutting apart those hard scales, but maybe he would find one on the next floor. Sylas' vision blurred, and when he appeared again, he was standing on a familiar cobblestone road. In the distance, it split in 2 directions, just like last time. After a moment, Sylas lugged the heavy, 5-meter-long python over his shoulder and began to walk toward the forest again. As much as he was curious about what was down the other path, he wasn't in a position to take risks for the hell of it. He would stick with what he knew for now and hope the situation would be the same. This was the only thought he could finish before a snake jumped out from a nearby bush, its jaws opening wide. Sylas couldn't even register exactly what it was. He just let his legs fall out from under him. With the pressure of Little Madness' weight on his shoulders, he winced. He hadn't had the time to brush the carcass off his shoulders and could only do his best to survive. The snake soared over his head even as Sylas lost his balance, the python corpse tilting him to one side. He couldn't pop back up quickly, and his legs folded under him awkwardly. Danger signs blared in his mind, not because he had awakened some magical sense for it, but because he knew he was screwed. He had been paying attention to his surroundings because he knew it was foolish to assume that Floor 2 would be the exact same as Floor 1. He just didn't expect that he would be attacked so suddenly. For all he knew, the snake that had just soared over his head was already doubling back, ready for round 2, and here he was, pinned beneath a dead python. Focus! He activated Madness without even trying to look back. He knew that if he wasted too much time, he would be finished. He still hadn't recovered from his battle with Little Madness, so he only had a minute or so left. The regret of not finding a place to use Mad Meditation first hit him. This was a new world. He always had to be near 100%, so long as he could spare the time. What was he rushing to enter a new floor for? With a grunt, he pushed the corpse off of him. Ignoring the dull pain in his right leg, he popped back up to his feet, whipping around toward where the sneak-attacking snake had gone. But he saw nothing but a line of trees. He didn't see anything, but that didn't mean he didn't hear anything. There was a wild thrashing in the grass, and when Sylas approached it, he found a snake of a little under 3 feet long. Its tail suddenly moved wildly and slapped against a tree trunk, blowing a chunk of the bark off of it. So strong. Sylas had a lot of experience corralling snakes, but he gave up on any idea of that when he saw that tail whip. Madness Minion F. Level 0. Physical 27. Mental 2. Will 4. I'm running out of time, Sylas thought, watching the snake wildly whip its body around without a care for its life. His head spun back to the python's corpse. He was ashamed of the idea he had just had, but he really couldn't think of anything else. The experience with Little Madness had taught him that there was truly no chance for him to deal a death blow to these monstrous creatures. He needed something that could. He picked up the head of the dead python, pulling it toward the thrashing Madness minion. By now, the much smaller snake had made it into the small path of grass leading to the boss of Floor 2, making it much easier on Sylas. The Madness minion didn't understand anything that was going on around it. It just wanted to attack something, anything. And yet, it didn't have the wherewithal to realize there was prey right in front of it. Sylas opened the jaws of Little Madness wide, baring its teeth for it. His green eyes never left the wildly moving snake. He knelt to a knee, his arm arching from holding up just the head of this monstrous boss creature. He wouldn't have more than one chance. The time he had left could be counted in a few seconds. When it fell below 10, he could already feel the weight of fatigue pushing at his mind. He knew what would happen if he pushed past his limit. He would truly fall into the madness, and he would be no different from the snake before him. The difference was that there would be no escaping from him. He pushed everything he had to the forefront, pulling deep as the snake got close. Now, the moment he moved, he knew he missed. The weapon was too awkward. How could he use the jaws of a creature that weighed hundreds of pounds to deal with a creature that was a fraction of the size and far faster? It was the most foolish plan he could have come up with, but it was the only option he had. He didn't know what would happen if he just tried to run away. Would he run into another beast? How many of them were in this forest with him? Also, what would happen to the snake once the influence of his madness left it? Would it still be in range to chase him? This much smaller beast had a weaker physical than Little Madness, but its speed was much greater. He didn't have a chance at outrunning it, and given the fact it could jump at his head from the ground despite only being over 2 feet long, he probably couldn't escape it by going up a tree either, not that he was even confident in climbing one. I'm going to miss. The swirl of thoughts hit him like a whirlwind as his madness timer fell to just 3 seconds. His will moved out in a flood, catching onto the wildly thrashing snake. He wasn't going to miss by much. He could feel that it would only be by an inch or two. The weapon was too awkward, and his dexterity and strength weren't high enough. But that was when this moment aligned with another. A moment where he had moved the shoreline of water back just enough. And under the influence of his charisma, will, and madness, the trajectory of the snake's wild movement shifted just enough that a single side of Little Madness Fong tore into its body.